Welcome to the Nietzsche Podcast Christmas Special. We didn't do one of these last year, or rather, I recorded a normal episode and loosely tied it in with Christmas. But this year we're back, and this is going to be like the first two Christmas specials that we did. If you don't know how that works, I've asked some friends of the show to contribute audio. Each contributor writes and records a piece about anything that they want to talk about, except there is always a single overarching topic. This year, the prompt is Christ and/or Dionysus. So our contributors today have some material recorded either about Jesus Christ or the Greek god Dionysus, or both of them. Within that, anything is fair game. It could be a tale of Nietzsche's experiences on Christmas, an exploration of the origins of Epiphany and the dating of Jesus' birth. It could be a meditation on the creative, destructive power of Dionysus. It could be recounting dreams you've had about Ariadne. We have a really incredible show lined up for you this time. We have contributions from all sorts of different people who I have collaborated with in the past, as well as my own dish that I brought for the Christmas potluck. There's a lot of fascinating material here. And so before we get going, I just want to give a warm thanks to everyone who was willing to join me in making this a very special Christmas special. Thank you to Andrei, to Weltgeist, to Craig, Mynaa, Vivienne, Tony, Neil, Paul, and Karl. I know everyone's pretty busy during the holidays, but that's the wonderful thing about the medium, about podcasts. Hopefully our show will accompany you on your long drives to gather with family, or in the kitchen while preparing a meal, or in your lazy hours after the customary feasting. There's simply nothing better than spending Christmas with some friends and loved ones, and in this way, even in audio form, we can reproduce the experience of gathering together. So grab a cup of warm mulled cider or your favorite holiday drink, grab your favorite snack, pull up a chair by the fireplace. This is the Nietzsche Podcast. Andrei Georgescu.
The Christmas of 1872 was an unusual Christmas for Nietzsche. The previous 3 years, Nietzsche had celebrated Christmas with Richard and Cosima Wagner. So why not 72? Wagner was a popular and important figure, so it was a big deal to be invited over for Christmas. He was a world-class musician whose premieres were national news. He had a king as a superfan and fan societies in different cities. At the time, he was successfully fundraising for a venue that would be entirely dedicated to spectacular festivals just for his own work. So, for example, on Christmas Day of 1869, Nietzsche helped set up the puppet theater for Wagner's kids and read Parzival with Cosima after lunch. On Christmas Day of 1870, Nietzsche came ready with gifts, and Wagner was quite happy with his engraving of The Night, Death, and the Devil by Albrecht Dürer. Cosima's gift was a draft of a manuscript which would eventually become The Birth of Tragedy. The Wagners loved it and said it's, quote, of the greatest value and excellence. On Christmas of 1871, Nietzsche wrote some music for Cosima, a piece called Echoes of New Year's Eve. And one of Nietzsche's biographers claims that Wagner, quote, couldn't bear to listen to the entire 15-minute piece and had to leave the room prematurely in order to refrain from laughing out loud. But the book was a delight. In January of 1872, Cosima reports that they were excited and stimulated by the splendid new book that Nietzsche published called The Birth of Tragedy. Richard said that it's the book he'd been longing for. Nietzsche stuck his neck out for Wagner in publishing Birth of Tragedy, since he opens with a foreword to Richard Wagner and casts him as the living hope for a rebirth of tragedy. The book itself was issued by Wagner's own publisher, and the closing chapters of the book hold up Wagner's music drama as modern tragedy's renewal, which is the kind of stuff that outraged scholars who saw it as a mythical puff piece about his favorite celebrity. One such outraged scholar was the fiery 23-year-old classicist Ulrich von Wilamowitz-Moellendorff, who wrote a polemic called Philology of the Future. The core charge in this polemic was that Nietzsche isn't doing source-based scholarship and actual philology, but rather something more like lyrical speculation to flatter Wagner. He misreads and misquotes texts and rides roughshod over evidence, and the whole thing about the Apollonian and Dionysian divide is a romantic myth that doesn't accurately reflect history. Same with the stuff about Socrates and Euripides. Wilamowitz was also being polemical, but his criticism stuck, and the whole incident established his career and practically toppled Nietzsche's. He went on to be a famous classicist, and even decades later, when he was 80, maintained that Nietzsche committed grape of historical facts and all historical method when writing Birth of Tragedy. And Nietzsche didn't let this slide, and more than a decade later, I think he used Zarathustra as a mouthpiece for his revenge on Wilamowitz and his scholarly ilk. Quote, "They keep a sharp eye on one another and do not trust each other the best. Inventive in petty cleverness, they lie in wait for those whose knowledge walks on lame feet. They lie in wait like spiders. I have always seen them prepare poison with caution, and always they donned gloves of glass for their fingers." End quote. This passage is meant to summon our compassion because of the natural revulsion most of us have when we see people preying on the weak, those whose knowledge walks on lame feet. We're meant to learn to be charitable to the crippled rather than to lie in wait like spiders and prepare poison. Wagner tried to defend Nietzsche's lame-footed knowledge by writing an open letter published in the North German General Newspaper, a kind of government-aligned paper close to Otto von Bismarck, but this attempt to propagandize respect backfired. In November of 1872, Cosima reported that the practical fallout was that no more students were showing up to Nietzsche's classes and that he had been excommunicated. She writes about possible solutions to the problem, like sending students to Basel or pressuring Bismarck to give Nietzsche a job in Berlin. Richard thinks that the aristocracy might be able to intervene to save Nietzsche's reputation. But Bismarck didn't come to save Nietzsche's reputation, nor did an aristocratic intervention materialize. And Nietzsche did not spend Christmas with the Wagners in 1872, instead choosing to send a letter of good wishes and spending it with his mother and sister instead. He did send a folder of manuscripts called 5 Prefaces to 5 Unwritten Books to the Wagners, which was received on New Year's Day of 1873. Cosima's review was unfavorable, remarking that the manuscript didn't help lift her spirits and that there are signs of a clumsy abruptness, however deep the underlying feelings. She concluded that he should stick to classical themes. So, when Nietzsche came to visit the Wagners the following spring, and they told him how much they disliked Strauss's new book, The Old Faith and the New, it was a good moment to prove himself. In his book, Strauss distanced himself from the quasi-religious adoration of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, which must have been unpleasant for Richard, since he revered Beethoven and even conducted the Ninth Symphony for big symbolic moments. Cosima's diaries are full of Beethoven devotion. And Strauss also didn't treat Schopenhauer with the reverence that the Wagners had for him, so Strauss's deflation of these figures meant that the Wagners were eager to have someone put Strauss in his place. And Strauss's book was very successful, which was a welcome reprieve from the decades of struggle and backlash he had gotten, all from daring to explain that the stories in the Gospels aren't historically reliable. Strauss's book on the historical Jesus is one of the big reasons Nietzsche stopped going to church and why he lost his faith in Christ. Strauss was one of the accomplices that killed God, so to speak. Strangely, it was the historical accuracy of the Gospels that was important for the man who was being accused of distorting history in service of a romantic myth. So I think that Nietzsche had the chance to atone for his public humiliation by publicly humiliating someone else. When Nietzsche insulted Strauss's inordinately stupid ease and contentment doctrine, I suspect he was the one having a hard time finding ease and contentment. But when Strauss died the year after Nietzsche's attack, we see his conscience surface. Quote, "I very much hope that I did not sadden his last months, and that he died without knowing anything about me. It's rather on my mind." End quote. The bite of conscience didn't stop there, though. In Nietzsche's last published book, which was more than a decade after the incident, I see a kind of shotgun approach into trying to assuage his conscience. He writes that actually, he's never felt pricks of conscience. Actually, his attack on Strauss was a huge success. Actually, he didn't really attack Strauss, he just attacked the ideas. Actually, he wanted to make a splash in society, so that's why he attacked Strauss. Actually, it's just really fun to attack people like Strauss, and he's very good at it. The most popular excuse that seems to have stuck in the secondary literature is that Strauss was only a magnifying glass to attack ideas, but I don't think that was the decisive motivation. Instead, I believe he tried to buy his belonging with a public attack on someone vulnerable, something he knew was ugly and would rather not name as such. The belonging lasted only a little while, and even inverted itself once he had his falling out with Wagner, but the attack lingered on in his mind. In his last book, he tries every costume available, like physician, explosive genius, posthumous saint, lonely monk who doesn't want any believers, leader of a new faith with a faculty to interpret his scripture, and they all say, "I am not vulnerable to my conscience, and I have done nothing wrong." Well, at the beginning of the year, I wrote a harsh polemic against Jordan Peterson, even though he's been a valuable influence for me. I was delighted at how successfully I was able to strike at his lame-footed knowledge. But I eventually decided to strip the names and keep the ideas, even though I've also grown suspicious of those. A few months later, Peterson fell seriously ill yet again, and I felt indebted to Nietzsche's experience. I was spared the self-disgust of being a spider who preys on the crippled, and thought, how glad I am that I didn't sadden him further this year. May he never even hear of my criticism. Even though I'm not on his radar at all, and he has endured far worse, I feel like I've evaded an unnecessary burden on my psyche. The lesson I take from this is that my conscience is above me. If that wasn't the case, then Nietzsche wouldn't be litigating his attack on Strauss so many years after the fact. One night after doing some work on this essay, I had a dream where a voice spoke 3 sentences to me, clear as if they'd been written on a blackboard. Number 1, you will end up criticizing what you used to love. Number 2, your conscience is above you. And number 3, be careful who you let into your life because they all matter. Now, it may sound strange to say that Nietzsche had a conscience that was above him, that it was something resistant to being dissolved by critical thought. But I think that's no weirder than saying that he had a stomach, because digestion and the need for calories reigns over any kind of polemical attack against it. Conscience, in this sense, behaves like an organ. You can rename it, psychologize it, historicize it, sneer at it, and yet the point is that some things just won't sit right. They just won't be metabolized. And rather than a final verdict on Nietzsche, I read this as a warning to myself and anyone tempted to buy satisfaction with a blow. The conscience you try to climb above will wait for you at the end. So, my Christmas message to myself is to treat conscience less like stuffy old dogma and more like a stomach. It is above you in the sense that it will make itself known whether you approve of it or not. Its demands are sometimes mistaken or exaggerated, but simple. Cultivate the right intention toward others through goodwill and restraint. For my dear audience, my message is to reject everything I claim and make your own discoveries. Zarathustra would probably applaud that. My Christmas wish is that when you go hunting for a lame-footed creature to pounce on and poison, you notice the part of you that still flinches, and that you give it, if not obedience, at least a hearing.
Weltgeist.
Schopenhauer once wrote that without death, philosophy would not exist. There would be no need to philosophize. I don't think that's entirely accurate. I think we can go one level deeper. I think the problem of suffering is the real impetus to philosophy. Adam in the Garden of Eden has no need for philosophy. Mere existence is fulfilling enough. Life, for Adam, is unconditionally good. He only has one real desire, for a mate, and God immediately obliges him in creating Eve for him. We can imagine that if God had not created Eve, then we might have found Adam start to philosophize, to look deep within his soul, to examine his life, to analyze his feelings, and maybe to problematize his existence. But before we can get to that point, Eve is given to him, and he goes on as untroubled as he ever was, until, of course, the fateful events of the fall of man unfold. In fact, the fall of man is precisely a religious story meant to explain where the suffering in the world comes from. It's quite revealing that in this story, suffering enters the world through the mistakes of mankind. The suffering is our fault. God even says it himself in Genesis. He created the world and saw that it was good. It was mankind who made it bad. The story does two things. It explains not only where suffering comes from by itself, it also explains why a benevolent God would allow evil to exist. At least it tries to provide that explanation. For millennia and for large amounts of people, that was enough. Christianity's victory is a historical fact. To use Schopenhauer's vocabulary, the ethics and metaphysics of Christianity have been enough to satisfy the metaphysical appetite of people for centuries. The Christian doctrine provides people with a framework to confront the age-old question of suffering, how to deal with it, and most importantly, how to give it meaning. It might be a good enough solution for the problem of suffering for billions of people, but is it healthy? This is a question that was rarely asked of the merits of religion until Nietzsche gave the concept of health, in terms of a philosophy or a worldview, center stage. And Nietzsche's indictment of Christianity is damning. In one famous passage, he says Europe abuses with great depravity two narcotics, alcohol and Christianity. I don't need to tell you that abusing alcohol is perhaps not the best way to deal with your problems. And Nietzsche says, neither is Christianity. But what is the alternative? For inspiration, Nietzsche looks at the times before Christianity, going back to the culture he admired the most, the ancient Greeks. Especially in his later philosophy, he would start to use the idea of Dionysus to symbolize or characterize a worldview opposite of Christianity. It would come to represent everything that Christianity is not. And the focal point of these two opposites is in their answer to the problem of evil and the subsequent valuation of life that they espouse. If Christianity is life-denying, then Dionysus is life-affirming. If Christianity focuses on the world beyond, then Dionysus focuses on the world of the here and now. If Christianity views suffering as indictment of this existence, something that will disappear once the kingdom of heaven is realized, then Dionysus knows that suffering is a part of the nature of existence, that it coexists with the good, and that the strong spirit can even indulge in it as a treat, for example, as an expression of an overflowing luxury and gratitude for life. The Dionysian spirit sees suffering not as a defect in the grand machinery of existence, but as a necessary component. And if the Dionysian spirit wants the power, health, and strength of the world, he must also want the suffering that comes with it. It's one of Nietzsche's insights that the great and terrible are intertwined, and one cannot exist without the other. An instructive paragraph on this is his brief discussion of Cesare Borgia in Beyond Good and Evil, or his many mentions of Napoleon Bonaparte. Greatness has a monstrous quality to it. This is true even outside of the political sphere. The artist also has a tyrannical will, and the philosopher likewise. All of this Nietzsche sees in the symbol of Dionysus. In a paragraph of his unpublished works, the compendium now known to us as The Will to Power, he talks about this Dionysian conception of religion as follows. Quote, "Readers will guess that the problem concerns the meaning of suffering, whether a Christian or a tragic meaning be given to it. In the first case, it is the road to a holy mode of existence. In the second case, existence itself is regarded as sufficiently holy to justify an enormous amount of suffering. The tragic man says yes even to the most excruciating suffering. He is sufficiently strong, rich, and capable of deifying to be able to do this. The Christian denies even the happy lots on earth. He is weak, poor, and disinherited enough to suffer from life in any form." End quote. Against the symbol of Christ on the cross, Nietzsche posits the symbol of Dionysus being ripped apart. Christ on the cross is a condemnation of life, says Nietzsche, a reminder to the faithful that this life is to be denied, that it's not as important as the afterlife. Dionysus, on the other hand, stands for a different symbolism. The myth of Dionysus, as it was known by the ancient Greeks, is complex and seemingly assembled from many different sources and influences. But one story tells of Dionysus Zagreus, the so-called chthonic or underworld Dionysus, which refers to the version of Dionysus who was dismembered because Zeus wanted him to be his successor at Olympus, but a jealous Hera turned him over to the Titans, who dismembered and devoured him. Athena, however, managed to save his heart. Another series of events unfolds, and ultimately, through his saved heart, Dionysus is reborn of a woman named Semele. Thus Dionysus attains the epithets of Dionysus the Dismembered and Dionysus the Twice Born, the god with two mothers, and we see two versions of Dionysus pop up in Greek art, once as a bearded old man and once as a youth. It's in this dual aspect of Dionysus, as the one who was tortured and reborn, that Nietzsche finds a potent symbol against the Christian conception of life. In his torture and dismemberment, Dionysus is a suffering god, but he affirms his suffering. He says yes to it, because he is of a sufficiently strong psychological constitution that he is able to affirm the totality of life, including all the bad parts. The suffering is a permitted luxury on the part of an overflowing abundance of gratitude for life. That is his role as a tragic god. Tragedy in how the Greeks conceived of it. Tragedy as an indulgence. The affirmation is symbolized by Dionysus as the god of rebirth, to which Nietzsche also attaches his doctrine of the eternal return. In The Will to Power, the chapter on Dionysus is immediately followed by his chapter on the eternal return, an idea that steadily gains more prominence in Nietzsche's thought as he develops intellectually. Dionysus is of course also the god of wine, but in this capacity he is also the god of the grape harvests. His mother is Persephone, goddess of spring. He is connected in this way to the eternal cycle of the seasons. All of this stands opposed to Christian ideals, and the opposition is quite striking and concrete. Dionysus remains firmly tethered to this earth. His dismemberment reverberates through the madness he inflicts upon others. He is a god of earthly passions and intoxication. In Euripides, Pantheus is dismembered by a group of crazed women followers of Dionysus, and according to legend, the god inflicts madness upon Lycurgus, the mythical king of Thrace, not the Spartan lawgiver, causing him to kill his son and cut off his own legs. Dionysus is always a god of the body. Christ, by contrast, is also tortured, but there is no spark of divinity anywhere in the torture. The focal point in the story of Jesus is not in his body, but in his spirit. In fact, Christ is so opposed to earthly and bodily things that the resurrected Christ tells Mary Magdalene, "Noli me tangere," don't touch me. Dionysus is also the god of the eternal return. The Christian conception of time, by contrast, is linear. Christ has lived, Christ died, Christ is resurrected. And at the end of time, we have the eschaton to look forward to, the ultimate end goal of creation, the end times, when all of history comes to a close. Thus, Nietzsche's conception of Dionysus really stands opposed to every single aspect of Christianity, down to even such metaphysical specifics as its conception of time. And it all comes back to the primordial question of philosophy, how to handle the suffering of life, and perhaps more fundamentally, the question of the value of life once we reckon with the fact that suffering is omnipresent. Do we affirm life in its totality, again and again in an eternal cycle, or do we say no to life and look forward to a completely different type of existence once our time on earth is up, thereby devaluing the worth of the here and now? That is the ultimate question that Nietzsche confronts us with, whether we follow Dionysus or the crucified.
Dionysus is the master of illusions, who could make a vine grow out of a ship's plank, and in general enable his votaries to see the world as the world is not.
Craig from Acid Horizon.
Hello there, listeners of the Nietzsche Podcast. This is Craig from the Acid Horizon Podcast and the Left Hand Podcast. And perhaps you remember my appearance on the Nietzsche Podcast with Keegan when we discussed the movie Eraserhead and Deleuze and some other ideas that we brought into the fray in that discussion. And Keegan reached out to me because he had this very clever idea of doing some sort of end-of-year holiday, Christmas, Hanukkah, Kwanzaa, solstice wrap-up episode where he asked me to talk about anything related to Nietzsche or Dionysian thought and to record my thoughts for maybe 10 to 15 to 20 minutes. And immediately I went to an essay that I had written for our recent compendium for the Erotic Tarot of George Bataille. This was a Kickstarter project where we developed a very limited edition tarot deck connected to the work of George Bataille. And sad to say that most all of these items are sold at the moment because we wanted to make it a very exclusive, kind of anti-commodity sort of product that was just in the hands of a few collectors and friends and listeners of the podcast. And for the deck, we also did this hardbound compendium, which actually is not out yet, so there will be some of those available. And I wrote for this particular compendium a reflection on the myth of Ariadne, of course using some of the ideas that we find in Nietzsche related to Ariadne, and then particularly Deleuze's discussion of the myth of Theseus and Ariadne that we see in the critical and clinical essays. And in fact, that essay is called The Mystery of Ariadne According to Nietzsche. And I thought perhaps I would bore you with some of the details of that. Maybe I'll give the Substack post that features that essay of mine to Keegan if you'd like to take a look at it. But I actually landed on something that I think would be particularly interesting to the Nietzsche podcast listeners to talk about instead. And given the fact that Keegan has covered the work of Carl Jung on the show, and I had an interest in Jung in my younger days, and then later on I got into the work of James Hillman before getting into Deleuze and Guattari, with whom I see a sort of mutual affinity. And it's no secret that even Deleuze had an affinity for Jung's work over and above the work of Freud, and that is recorded in the essay on masochism that we see in Coldness and Cruelty. And then, of course, Deleuze's reflection as the unconscious as a site of problematization that we see in difference and repetition. All of this may be an unnecessary preface to talk about the thing that I'm going to talk about right now, which is a dream that I had when I was in Sils Maria, staying at the Edelweiss Hotel, which is just next to the home of Friedrich Nietzsche for, 6 or 7 summers, where he wrote some of his most notable works, including Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And the reason that I want to talk about this dream is that it was so profound, and the message that I received after it, the voice in my mind that spoke to me upon waking, was absolutely uncanny. In fact, the dream that I dreamt was said by this voice to have been Nietzsche's dream, whatever that means. Perhaps a dream that he had in his life, some variation of it. And if you have been listening to the Acid Horizon podcast or the Left Hand podcast, you know that I'm the kind of person who puts some stock in my own dream life. And the reason that that is the case is that as a very young boy, I had many, many vivid dreams, to the point that I thought this is the way that everyone's life was. And there was a particular point in my life where I experienced a depression. And on the cusp of entering into that depression, I experienced a series of incredible night terrors, which were so harrowing and so terrifying that it actually drove me to dream therapy. And that was the catalyst for my relationship with the work of Carl Jung and then later on James Hillman. I had those particular dreams living overseas, and I was living in Japan, in fact, and I saw one of the most notable Jungian therapists in Japan at the time. And it was an incredible journey, to say the least. And I'll spare you the details of all of that, but let's go to the dream that I had while staying in Sils Maria. I imagine that many of you out there who maintain an affinity for Nietzsche's work would love to go on a pilgrimage to the Upper Engadine in Switzerland, just on the border of Italy, where Nietzsche stayed and hiked. And it is an absolutely gorgeous locale. And it seems like the most unlikely of places to have a nightmare, but let's just get to the dream that I had. And here's what I would like from you. I'd like you to reach out to me. I would love to hear from the armchair Jungians, the armchair Freudians and Lacanians, and I want you to tell me what you think I dreamt. Okay, so here was the dream, October 8th in 2024 in Sils Maria. The quote-unquote event was about to take place. We were going to celebrate the introduction or appearance of Nietzsche, but it was more than that. It was a world historical event. Together, quote-unquote, we were crowded into a luxurious castle. It was a lifetime of friends and antagonists, all in one place. Interlopers, threats, and incursions presented themselves to no avail. They either became part of the party or altogether dissipated. It was an indestructible party, the impenetrable castle, and the festivities raged on. As the party wound down, I saw a woman lying on the floor of the room where I was to sleep. I had seen her long ago. She was from a foreign land, almost disinterested. She lounged on the floor, allowing me to gaze at her. I was more mature now. I knew not to proposition her in the way that I once did in a dream that I had long ago. She had a sort of ineffable quality. She could not be captured by any heart or mind. Realizing the futility of approaching her, I made my way back out to the party. But the party was dying now. I returned to the room where I hoped to find her again. She was there, though she was draped in long sheets of lace and textile fabric. She was smothered in the material one might use to make a wedding gown. I didn't know if she was dead or alive. However, suddenly, in my mind's eye, the party had appeared again. But this time, it was for a cosmic war. They were raging against the presence of the woman. Their mode of attack was to raise the image of multiple golden idols, who appeared almost as like bodhisattva, but bearing arms. The idols came forward like a column of soldiers, each one valiantly rising to subdue the woman, but all of them falling into a shadow from which they had arisen. Their numbers seemed endless, but the war of attrition raged on. I realized there was no army that could match her power. The scene faded. And it was probably 5:30 or 6 a.m., perhaps, when I had this dream. And I awoke with my chest pounding like it had never pounded before. I wondered if I was having a heart attack. My wife, the hotel room that we stayed in had two separate, almost like twin beds. It was almost like a cabin. And I woke her up. I said, my heart is pounding. I don't know if I'm having a heart attack or what, but I quickly recovered from that. And, I was upset that I woke up my wife. And then I just decided to take a walk outside in the dark around the village that was Silmaria, and also have a look at Nietzsche's house, which is now called Nietzsche House, and which at that point I had not been in yet. And as I mentioned, upon waking, I heard this voice in my head that said that was Nietzsche's dream, whatever that meant. Each one of us has our own unique relationship with Nietzsche's work. I don't think any one of us could call ourselves a full-blown Nietzschean, because that would mean to embody all of his particular contradictions, and that's just not who we are. And of course, there are things in Nietzsche's work that we all tend to focus on. One of the things that I tend to look at is his relationship towards women, which is complicated to say the least, but of course, for me, is problematic by the standards that I live by. But one of the interpretations of Nietzsche's work that I tend to follow is that of Gaston Bachelard's in the essay where he talks about the sort of elemental dimension of Nietzsche's work, where Nietzsche is a philosopher of air. He is a philosopher of heights and of spirit. And there is a distinction that the archetypal psychologist James Hillman makes between this sort of airy spirit realm that he calls pneuma, as opposed to this more aqueous dimension of the soul known as psyche. So this is the distinction that Hillman makes, pneuma and psyche. And if we are to believe that in any way Nietzsche follows Heraclitus in the primacy of the dryness of the soul, or this affinity that Heraclitus maintained for the dryness of the soul over the kind of wetness and the murkiness of what perhaps James Hillman would call psyche. Now, there is a complicated relationship that Hillman has to Heraclitus, which is reflected in a particular essay that he wrote about Heraclitus. But to get back to the dream for a moment, I am a man. I identify with my masculinity to a certain extent. And one might argue that the figure that I saw in my dream is an anima figure, if we're going to use the lens of Carl Jung or James Hillman, who is pretty invested in the anima archetype as well. That is a kind of easy out. But if we look at what is particularly important to Hillman's method of dream interpretation and image work, it's not simply about reaching for these reductive categories. We want to look for particularities in the image. What are things that stood out about that particular image that spoke to me? In this particular dream, the woman that I saw at first blush seemed almost asleep and quite lethargic. And perhaps the most interesting and pronounced aspect of that image was her body laying atop the lace and silk that was needed to make some sort of gown, which seemed to be like a wedding gown. And I think a very easy interpretation here is we are presented with the materials for a marriage, matrimony, a consummation of sorts. This is the gown that could be, but not yet is. And if that is the case, what does that mean? What does that bring up? There was a particular figure in this World Historic Party that was excluded from the event, and then once introduced into the event, went on an absolute warpath, destroying all of these famous men and gods and demigods and titans with absolute ease. It might be interesting to note that the second night, I had a follow-up dream. This was on October 9th, 2024. And in this dream, I am looking into space. And what I see is a large, luminous square. And it might be interesting to note, I don't think I ever really dream of space or the stars or the planets, but clearly we're having dreams at the galactic level. And this square that I see, like I said, it's almost like this luminous kind of phosphorescent giant square in the middle of the sky. And the voice in my mind says to me, this is the real, almost like the real with a capital R. And then I see another square frame kind of coming in from the right side, from my vantage point. And inside that square frame is my wife, my actual real life wife. And she's waving goodbye to me. She's bidding me goodbye. And the squares touch at the top corners and they start to merge together. So this image of my wife is merging with what is called the real, I guess we would say in all caps. And once again, I awaken, kind of a cold sweat. I don't recall having the heart attack level chest pain that exact night, but it was a pretty freaky dream yet again. But what these two dreams have in common is the feminine either being displaced or repressed, put somewhere else, compartmentalized. Or, like in the second dream, we see the compartmentalized image of the ultimate woman, my wife, right? Being dissipated on contact with this cosmic abstract entity. And one of the things that's actually coming up for me right now and recalling these dreams is that the woman in the Nietzsche dream was a figure of fantasy. And this is a woman that has not yet been married. The woman in the second dream, who was clearly my wife and was boxed into this particular frame, is somebody who is dissipated. And I actually enjoy the tension there. Because if we see the woman in the Nietzsche dream as a figure of the imagination, of the imaginal life itself, almost like an anima figure, I think the consummation of the relationship with that woman, the mysterium conjunctionis, as it were, is something that has not yet taken place. And we might say that the dream that I had the second night was either the inverse or the obverse of that dream, where I did see somebody to whom I was married, but that image was dissipated. And that created a kind of awkward but somewhat enjoyable tension. If you dream the way that I dream, I love coming out of a dream with that sort of inchoate blend of ecstasy, chaos, confusion, and terror. One of the Greek myths that I'm most fond of is probably the story of Theseus and Ariadne, and then the later marriage of Ariadne to Dionysus. There's no one consensus on what this story is like, and so in this particular essay that I will pass along to Keegan, I reimagine it in terms that do resonate, I think, somewhat with my dream life. And one of the things that I want to argue is that even though Dionysus is the god of ecstasy, Dionysus is also the god of a kind of uncanny silence. And in the rendering that I put forward in this compendium that we have created, I make it so that Ariadne is the figure that brings a kind of silence, this aqueous well. She is the figure who emboldens Dionysus by creating a space of silence where the ecstatic powers can be incubated. And so I create a little story about that. And over the course of my life, I've had many dreams where I see this sort of ineffable woman figure, a woman who cannot be possessed, unlike Ariadne, who was initially possessed and raptured by the image of Theseus. One really strong interpretation of the Ariadne myth is that Ariadne gives up her divine birthright and destiny to be with a mortal hero, and she has to go through this trial and suffer the burden of the hero before she is ultimately restored to a relationship with divinity through Dionysus. One of the ways that image sometimes cashes out in a psychotherapeutic space is consider those times in our lives where we attach ourselves to things, practices, or people that seem like wrong turns. And then when we come out of those spaces and then we slot into something that feels a little bit more familiar, like the soul has come home, not only is there a great sense of relief, but the soul feels empowered in a way. And this form of narrative or trope repeats itself in relationships, for example, that we identify as toxic. Consider, for example, if you were the kind of person who was with someone who was just absolutely not good for you, but you could only see that after the fact. But you took on their emotional burdens, you took on their pain, their suffering, and you made it your own and probably crafted your identity around it in some way. And then, for whatever reason, you became extricated from that relationship. Either you initiated the breakup or they did or what have you. And later on, perhaps you find yourself in another relationship or in another life situation where you find yourself, once again, more at home and more attuned to what is most nourishing to you, your heart, and your psychic life. There are a few fantastic interpretations of the Ariadne myth, but that's one in particular that I like because I think that's one that has been resonant in my life, where I've committed myself to something that was absolutely not my lane, so to speak, and then at some point, you find yourself in the right spot and with the right people. And then sometimes it's the case you revisit your old self or you see the people to whom you were attached previously, but they just don't have the hooks in like they used to because you have found that font of nourishment. That's something that has kind of happened in my own life. Anyway, damn it, I'm probably going to go over the 20 minutes, but if you have listened this far, I would only ask that you support Keegan when he teaches a class on Nietzsche's experiment with truth in January 2026 on the Acid Horizon Research Commons. I keep about 10 or 12 podcasts in the rotation. Keegan's is one of them because he is a reliable and trustworthy presenter of Nietzsche's ideas. And I expect that he will become an absolute asset to our program. So please join us there. Keegan will give you all the details. And for the rest of the winter season, take care of yourself. And thanks for having me on the show, Keegan.
I have a letter here from a little boy to the North Pole asking for Santa. Just kidding. This is something that my friend Karl wrote. He wasn't able to record a contribution for the Christmas special this year, but he wrote it. It's pretty short, and he asked me to read it, and he formatted it as though it were a letter. And so even though I wish Karl could have recorded something, I think it was important to have his contribution here because he's been part of the show since the very beginning, and he's been part of past Christmas specials. So here is Karl's letter to the North Pole, or rather to me. Dear Keegan, let's do something silly. Imagine your brain is China. All the rivers of China are your drives. They are trying to get to the ocean. As the Yellow River floods a village, maybe that is a mental rupture of rage against an unfair world. Canals are built on the Mekong. What seemed incomprehensible is ordered. An irrigation system was built on the Yangtze. Maybe that is your love being driven into a job you believe in, like water into the rice paddies. Over hundreds of years, the rivers shift. Over the course of your life, drives shift in their social and material expression. What is a gift? You're trying to get to the ocean, and so am I. A good gift helps you get there, and a bad gift makes your journey worse. Are we wasting water? A bad idea is like a dam of mental energy that can't help but harm. This extended metaphor pokes at the Chinese flood myth. Emperor Gun is struck down for building a dumb dam. His son Yu is glorified forever for his irrigation channels. This is some silly metacognition, but are you the son, Yu, or stuffy Gun? Am I Yu, or Gun, and how I relate to you? When we think about intellectual gifts, it is a matter of human liberation, power, and dignity. Or, if we are being more humble, a curiosity pumping. In honor of that gaffer, Zarathustra, I'd like to draw some attention to a quote from On the Old and New Tablets. Quote, "For once more will I go unto men, amongst them will my sun set, in dying will I give them my choicest gift. From the sun did I learn this, when it goeth down, the exuberant one, gold doth it then pour into the sea, out of inexhaustible riches, so that the poorest fisherman roweth even with golden oars. For this did I once see, and did not tire of weeping in beholding it. Like the sun will also Zarathustra go down. Now sitteth he here and waiteth, old broken tables around him, and also new tables, half written." End quote. Merry Christmas, you happy oarsmen. Sincerely, your friend, Karl. Well, thank you, Karl. I'm not really sure that this is in the, under the general topic of the prompt that I gave, but I guess insofar as we're talking about selfless gift giving, it's in the spirit of Christmas. And I'm just happy for the gift of Karl participating. And also, he wrote this to me before he even knew that I was covering Eastern philosophy on the show in recent episodes and in some upcoming episodes. So that's an interesting synchronicity. But in any case, Merry Christmas to you, Karl. I hope you get all the toys you asked Santa for this year. And I hope you have a great time with your family. And let's get on to our next contributor.
It's Christmas Eve at last in Summerfield, and it couldn't be a prettier one. There's a beautiful, clean blanket of snow covering the streets and sidewalks and yards and roofs, and a few flakes still drifting down in the twilight.
Neil, Gnostic Informant.
Every year during Christmas time, there's always a plethora of information on the internet regarding the origins of Christmas, December 25th, Saturnalia, Yule, pagan roots, and sometimes a lot of the information is actually backed up by the primary sources and scholarship, and other times it's not. Unfortunately, there's a plethora of misinformation as well regarding gods born on December 25th of a virgin and whatnot. However, not all of it is misinformation. When it comes to the topic of Dionysus and Jesus, there is a very well-established tradition of the Epiphany on January 6th and the Epiphany of Christ, also celebrated by the Orthodox Church to this very day on January 6th. To start this off, we have to go back to the ancient pagan sources from the likes of Aristotle, Diodorus of Sicily, Plutarch, Theopompus, Seneca the Younger, Pliny the Elder, and Pausanias. Through these primary sources, we get a collection of traditions about the god Dionysus being born in the wintertime, and the word they use specifically for his coming is the word epiphany, epiphania. The oldest of these sources comes from Aristotle. Aristotle wrote a book called On Marvelous Things Heard, often just called Mirabilia. And in this book, he tells us that in the city of Elis, there is a building 8 stades away from the city in which the Dionysia is celebrated, in which the priests of Dionysus would set up 3 bronze cauldrons. When they have done this, they would call upon the visiting Greeks who wished to examine the vessels and seal up the doors of the house of the temple. When they go to open it, they show the seals to the citizens and strangers and then open it. Those that go in find the cauldrons full of wine. They would say, according to this miracle of empty jars filling with wine overnight, this was the mark of the epiphany of the god Dionysus. Another source from Theopompus, dated to the 4th century BCE, preserved in Athenaeus, Book 1, Chapter 61, he tells us also in the city of Elis, once again, matching up with Aristotle, it says that the natives at the temple where the Dionysian games are celebrated close up 3 empty brazen vessels. They seal them in the presence of all the people, and at a subsequent time, they end up being filled with wine the next day. So we have 2 corroborating sources roughly in the same century from Theopompus and Aristotle. Fast forward a couple centuries later, Diodorus of Sicily gives us a way more detailed account of this sort of miracle that happens. He gives us a backstory. In Bibliotheca, Book 1, Chapter 23, he tells us that Cadmus, who was an Egyptian citizen of Thebes, begat several children, one of them who is Semele. Now you might know, if you're a Greek mythology fan, Semele is the traditional mother, mortal mother, of Dionysus. But in this story, Diodorus uses the name Osiris as a placent for Dionysus. He says, when Semele was violated by an unknown person, she became pregnant and after 7 months gave birth to a child whose appearance that the Egyptians hold today as Osiris. Now, such a child born only 7 months is not normally brought into the world alive, because this is contrary to the will of the gods and nature does not permit it. But when Cadmus found out what had taken place, having the same time a reply from an oracle commanding him to observe the laws of his fathers, he both gilded the infant, paid it appropriate sacrifices, and on that ground established the Epiphany of Osiris among men. What's interesting about this primary source is that later on, Saint Epiphanius, a 4th century saint of the Catholic and Orthodox Church alike, tells us a story about Jesus being born after 7 months exactly. He says this: Christ was born in the 42nd year of Augustus, conceived on the 12th before the calends of July or June. I have noticed too that those who have given a date for the conception, Gabriel's bringing tidings to the Virgin, have said a supposition of certain persons who have it by tradition that Christ was born after a term of 7 months. Now here's the interesting part. The very next sentence, he gives the names of the months, but he doesn't use the traditional Roman or even Greek name of the month. He uses Tybi or Tubi, which is the Egyptian name of the month that correlates to January and December. So it's the month of Tybi in Egyptian calendar would be roughly from December 15th to January 15th. And he says in this exact passage, for I have found that there is a time of 7 lunar months, 4 days between the month they mention, 11th of Tybi, the 8th before the Ides of January, which is January 5th. In fact, the Epiphany came and Christ was born. So not only does Epiphanius use the same month of Egyptian month, he also says that Christ was born, according to this tradition that you might not know about, of 7 months premature, and then he even uses the same Greek word for epiphany. A couple of things line up perfectly there, but it gets even crazier. Epiphanius, in the same book, tells us another tradition about the birth of Christ, and in this particular passage, this is what he says: For indeed, the Savior was born in the 42nd year of Augustus, emperor of the Romans during the 13th consulship, together with Silanus, as recorded in the Roman consulships. It is stated thus: during their consulship, that is, the 13th of Octavius and Silanus, Christ was born 8 days before the calends of January, 13 days after the winter solstice, and in the addition of light and day. This day is celebrated by the Greeks, the idolaters, on the 8th before the calends of January, which the Romans call Saturnalia, the Egyptians call Chronia, and the Alexandrians call Caecalia. For on the 8th day before the calends of January, this division occurs, which is the solstice, and the day begins to increase and light gains addition, completing a number of 13 days up to the 8th before the calends of January, January 5th, each day adding 30 hours up to the day of Christ's birth, as also the wise Ephraim among the Syrians has testified to this word in his explanations, saying, thus was ordained the coming of our Lord Christ Jesus, the birth according to the flesh, or rather, the perfect incarnation, which is called, drumroll, Epiphany. So he uses that word again. From the beginning of increase of light for a span of 13 days. For this also had to become a type of our Lord Jesus Christ and his 12 disciples, fulfilling the number of 13 days of light's increase. And he's talking about the 12 days in between the winter solstice, which was December 25th, during this time when they used the Julian calendar, and January 5th. Now, he then goes on to say, and many other things have happened, and happen in support and testimony of this word, that is, of Christ's birth. For even the leaders of the idolatry religion, forced to confess a part of the truth, and the deceivers and deceive those convinced by them, idolaters in many places conduct a great festival on that very night of the Epiphany, so that those hoping in deception would not seek the truth. First in Alexandria, in the so-called Corium. Let me just pause. He says here, this is the great temple of the precinct of Cori. Now, some of you, your Greek mythology radar is going off because you know, in the traditions of Dionysus' first incarnation, birth of Zagreus, his mother is Cori. So Epiphanius is talking about these idolaters celebrating the birth of a god. He doesn't say his name is Dionysus here, but he says his mother is Cori. That's Dionysus' mother. He says then, for staying awake the entire night with certain songs, with flute singing to the idol, spending the whole night after the crowing of roosters, they descend with torches into a certain underground shrine and bring out a certain wooden statue seated on a litter, naked, having golden seal of a cross on the forehead and 2 other such seals on each hand, and another 2 on 2 knees, together the 5 seals made of gold. And they carried the statue around the middle of the temple 7 times with flutes and drums and hymns. And after celebrating, they again bring it down into the underground place. Being asked what this mystery is, they reply and say that at this hour today, the Cori, that is the Virgin, gave birth to Ion. Now, Ion is not a god who a lot of people know about, but if you actually do your research and you find out who Ion is, the primary sources pretty much indicate that Ion is a syncretic 2nd century deity who is worshipped primarily in Egypt and in Syria, who's a syncretic version of the god Dionysus and Osiris. In fact, the Suda, a Byzantine encyclopedia from the Byzantine period, 9th century, 10th century text called the Suda, actually says that Ion is Osiris hyphenated Dionysus. So here we have Epiphanius telling us a story about a god called Ion, born of the Cori, Dionysus' mother, on December 25th / January 6th. He connects those days between 12 days of light increase. But then he says one more thing after that. He says, this also happens in Petra, the city, the metropolis of Arabia, which is Edom in the scriptures. And the idol in the temple there, they praise the virgin in Arabic dialect, calling her in Arabic Ka'abu, that is Cori or virgin. And the one born from her, Dusaris, that is the only begotten of the Lord. This takes place in the city of Elusa and on the night as they're in Petra and in Alexandria. Dusaris is an Arabian god, also an agricultural fruit and vine deity, very similar to Dionysus. A lot of scholars compare Dusaris to Dionysus. So Epiphanius is actually giving us different traditions of different gods who have some sort of a Dionysian backdrop, born of a virgin around the winter solstice or January 6th. Now, the question remains, which one's the first one to have this January 6th winter solstice birthday? Well, it turns out in the writings of Plutarch says that Harpocrates was born of Isis at the winter solstice. Now, when Plutarch talks about this birth of Harpocrates, he says something pretty interesting here. He says, Isis, when she perceived that she was pregnant, put on herself an amulet on the 6th day of the month of Theophi, and about the time of the winter solstice, she gave birth to Harpocrates, imperfect and premature. There we go with that premature birth thing again. And then he says, amid early flowers and shoots, for this reason, they bring him in as an offering the first fruits, and they celebrate the days of his birth after the spring equinox, which is another interesting, we have a little connection between spring equinox and winter solstice, kind of like Easter and Christmas. Pliny the Elder, at the end of the 1st century, right around the same time as Plutarch, also talks about a festival called the Theodosia. This is a Natural History, Book 3, 231. It is accredited by Mucianus, who was a 3 times consul, that water flowing from a spring in the temple of Father Liber, Dionysus, on the island of Andros, has the flavor of wine on January 5th, which is called the Theodosia, God's gift day. Now, it's interesting that he has this passage about water flowing from a stream that turns into wine on January 5th. Because if we go back to Epiphanius, the same saint that I cited earlier, in another chapter, he talks about another tradition of Jesus being born on January 6th and having a similar wine miracle. He says this, on the 11th of the Egyptian month of Tybe, the first miracle in Cana of Galilee, when water was made wine, and was performed about the 11th day, 30 years later, talking about January 5th, on the 30th birthday of Jesus, apparently. And even to this day, says Epiphanius, this happens in many places as a testimony to unbelievers, because of the miracle which was wrought at that time. Streams and rivers in many localities testify by being changed to wine. The stream at Kibere, the chief city of Caria, which is in modern-day Turkey, at the same day, January 5th, servants drew water, and Christ says, give it to the governor of the feast. And the stream at Gerasa in Arabia testifies in the same way. I myself have drunk from Kibere myself, and my brethren have drunk from the same stream. And in Egypt too, many give testimony of the Nile. So, what do we have here? Well, we have in Epiphanius, we have traditions of Jesus being born 7 months premature and being called an Epiphany on January 5th or 6th. And then you have in these pagan traditions that are centuries prior, we're talking 1st century BC, 1st century AD, and whatnot, Pliny the Elder, Plutarch, Diodorus, they also talk about Dionysus / Osiris being born 7 months premature at the winter solstice or January 5th, and they call it an Epiphany. Seneca the Younger, writing in the 50s of the Common Era, writes this, Argos paid homage to Bacchus in his stepmother's presence. Naxos, ringed by the Aegean Sea, gave in marriage a deserted maiden, requiting her loss with a better husband. From its dry pumice flowed Nyctalian liquor. Shattering streams cut through the grass. The earth drank deep of the sweet fluids. White springs of snowy milk and lesbian wine, blended with scented thyme. The new bride was escorted to the vast heavens. Phobos, with hair flowing down to his shoulders, sang the ceremonial hymn, while twin cupids swung their torches. Jove laid aside his fiery weapon and abhorred the thunderbolt at Bacchus's Epiphany. And he uses the word epiphany here. So once again, we have a tradition of an epiphany of Dionysus where water is turned into wine. Also, Plutarch in the life of Lysander, written around 100 CE, talks about the Thebans who had remained outside, taking the city on their left, advancing on their rear, at the spring called Kisusa. Here, the story goes, his nurses bathe the infant Dionysus after his birth, for the water has the color and sparkle of wine, is clear and very pleasant to the taste. Pausanias in the 2nd century, retelling what Aristotle says about these 3 jars of water miraculously being filled with wine on this special day of the year called the Epiphany for Bacchus. Well, it turns out that the wedding at Cana that happens in the Gospel of John is celebrated by the Orthodox and Catholic Church on January 6th. In fact, the night of January 5th is the night of the Epiphany, they call it. They call it the eve of the Epiphany tide, the Epiphany eve, they call it. And not only that, they celebrate the Epiphany of Christ on that very day. So to this very day, you have the Orthodox Catholic Church celebrating the Epiphany of Christ on January 6th and the miracle that he performed at the wedding at Cana. And those very specific traditions all have roots in these pagan sources about Dionysus being born or having an epiphany on January 5th or 6th, and also being accompanied by some type of water turning into wine miracle, whether it be jars filling up miraculously or streams of water miraculously turning into wine. This holiday season, remember, while you're in that 12-day period between the winter solstice and the January 5th Epiphany tide, remember that the roots of all of this goes back to our great Greek ancestors. And so drink a little bit of wine this holiday season. Even if you're not a Christian, this is a season for everybody. This is a pagan season, and it's a Christian season as well. So Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, and Yo Saturnalia.
P.F. Jung.
Luke chapter 12, verse 51. And Jesus said, "Do you think I came to bring peace on earth? No, I tell you, but division. From now on, there will be 5 in one family divided against each other, 3 against 2, and 2 against 3." If you're someone who cares about the trajectory of modern politics, then you need to be aware of the civil war going on within Christianity, the outcome of which will have a determinative effect on the future of right-wing political movements. While there are many different theological conflicts within Christianity at any time, there is one that I believe is most fundamental. There are 2 sides in this civil war. We can call them the moderates and the conservatives. These 2 sides are waging a war over the true meaning of a single story in the Bible, the controversial story of Jesus cleansing the temple. The canonical story is told in 3 different books in the Bible, in the Gospels of Mark, Luke, and John. In each book, the story is no more than a dozen verses. Here's the story from the Gospel of John. The Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple he found those who were selling oxen and sheep and pigeons, and the money changers sitting there. And making a whip of cords, he drove them all out of the temple, with the sheep and the oxen. And he poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. And he told those who sold the pigeons, "Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of trade." Now, even if you've never opened a Bible in your life, you will know that this version of Jesus is very much at odds with the, quote, "love thy enemy and turn the other cheek" version of Jesus that defines the core ethos of modern Christianity. The key thing to realize is that this story is the front line of the hermeneutic civil war between the moderates and conservatives. And it's not difficult to understand why. If Christians are called to imitate Jesus, does this mean imitating his behavior in the temple? The moderates say that Jesus was justified in taking up a whip and driving out the money changers because, unlike the rest of us, Jesus is the Son of God, and his anger is always righteous by definition. If, quote, "let he who is without sin cast the first stone" is the operative rule, Jesus is the one sinless person who's actually allowed to cast the first stone. But the conservatives say that Jesus modeled a type of justified aggression for Christians to imitate. When opportunists take advantage of others and defile sacred spaces, Christians are called to take action against them, not merely to turn the other cheek. If you take the moderate interpretation of the story, the underlying moral philosophy that informs your actions will differ quite drastically than if you take the conservative interpretation of the story. A moderate Christian might believe it's wrong to use the force of law to impose Christian morality on others, while a conservative Christian might argue that's exactly what Jesus called us to do. What's more, this theological divide is playing out more and more in the public discourse. Tucker Carlson had a pastor called Andrew Isker on his podcast where he discussed this very issue, making the case for a more conservative interpretation of the story. On the other hand, you have people like James Tallarico, who are representative of the more moderate version of Christianity, who explain how the story of Jesus does not justify the more fire and brimstone approach. Once you see what's going on, the drastic implications of this theological debate has for the future of right-wing politics are made clear. You see, every Sunday, tens of millions of Americans, and growing, attend church and listen to their priest or pastor's sermon. The cultural power that these theological influencers have is on par with the cultural power of social media, Hollywood, and the public school system. Any given priest or pastor will have either a more moderate or more conservative interpretation of the story of Jesus in the temple. And when it comes to theological issues, the overwhelming majority of church parishioners merely imitate the beliefs of their faith leader. Imagine if 80% of priests and pastors began adopting the more conservative interpretation of the story of Jesus in the temple. Tens of millions of American Christians would leave church with an increasingly conservative moral philosophy, which would directly impact their politics in terms of who they support and how they vote. Priests and pastors are on the front end of what I call the meme adoption curve. They engage in complex theological studies and debates about different biblical interpretations, disputes between church fathers, and so on. Then they translate the ideas, the memes, they derive from these studies into actionable sermons that their parish receives on Sunday. Just as a small number of professors and educators can influence millions through the education system, a small number of theological influencers can alter the cultural political destiny of the religious right. Everyone understands that politics is downstream from culture, but if you look a bit closer, you'll see that culture is downstream from theology. And this is why the rise of something like Christian nationalism is such an important and interesting political phenomenon. As the postmodernists correctly point out, any given text, and certainly one as complex and nuanced as the Bible, can be interpreted in a near infinite number of ways. And deciding which interpretation is correct is not some objective scientific process, but a more subjective one, contingent on personal biases and political self-interest. But the nuance here is that while there are many different ways to interpret the Bible, the set of viable interpretations is actually quite narrow. The viability of one's interpretation largely being influenced by what happens when you act out a moral philosophy predicated on your interpretation. And this is what makes Christianity so resilient as an idea. There's enough interpretive flexibility built into the text, with seemingly contradicting stories of Jesus turning the other cheek versus him putting together a whip of cords. This means both the pacifist and fire and brimstone approach to Christianity can be adopted according to the needs of the Christians within the culture they live in. When Christian theocrats attempt to assert power for themselves, there's interpretive ammunition within the Bible to resist them. The verse, "Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and render unto God what is God's," is the classic Christian argument against theocracy. And when culture becomes godless and morally relativistic and demands that Christians cower and withdraw, there are just as many verses, like the story of Jesus in the temple, that Christians can interpret as an injunction to fight back against the wickedness of this fallen world. And that is what the Christian nationalists are capitalizing on. And so, if you're like me, you probably have at one point believed there are few things more useless in the world than studying theology. After all, surely God isn't real, so how could these hermeneutic debates about the nature of God and the meaning of religious parables be of any real value? But when you realize that theology, and Christianity more specifically, serves as the underlying operating software that the rest of our culture depends on, you start to realize the incredible amount of political leverage that Christian theology has in the West and in the United States in particular. Until next time, good luck, Godspeed, and Merry Christmas.
Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who being in the form of God, thought not equality with God a thing to be hung on to, but humbled himself and made himself of no reputation, and was found in fashion as a man, and became obedient to death.
Tony One Dime.
All right, so I decided to speak about the two things Nietzsche hated the most, Christianity and socialism. What would be better for the Nietzsche podcast than to discuss the things that he detested the most? And there really couldn't be a more timely topic for Christmas than Christianity itself. Here I will present an essay that I wrote titled The Christian Case Against Capitalism. Okay, let's begin. It is already well known that there has been a long historical legacy of Christian socialist movements in various parts of the world, and there have been many great Christian figures who have embraced democratic socialist politics. You often find leftists today who will point out the clear socialistic components of Christianity in order to show how Christian Republican conservatives are just hypocrites with their free market Jesus. Yet, using the socialistic components of Christianity to point out the hypocrisies of the Christian right in America is an argument often made by people who themselves aren't Christians, or by Christians who are more leftist than they are Christians, if you know what I mean. And as a result, the argument rings a little hollow. And while I'm certainly not the first person to lay out a Christian critique of capitalism, it is rare to see one fully lay out the Christian case for socialism, or rather the Christian case against capitalism. And I say Christian case because while Christian socialism might overlap with modern liberal secular forms of socialism, like modern democratic socialism, Marxism, or even libertarian socialism, the Christian case for socialism is fundamentally different. This difference lies not just in the end goal, as Christian socialists, like secular socialists, are inevitably going to disagree on how exactly socialism is to be manifested. Rather, what truly sets Christian socialists apart from the liberal atheist forms of socialism is the reasons for being against capitalism. And these reasons are very important for understanding why a Christian case for socialism would be based on a fundamentally different rationale. Understanding these differences in first principles is essential to grasping why a Christian case for socialism would constitute its own distinct political philosophy, a case for socialism based on fundamentally Christian principles. While secular leftist movements locate their ultimate value in liberation, whether it be individual and collective liberation, the Christian case for socialism would make freedom secondary to a higher principle of justice. From this Christian perspective, one would not believe in freedom just for freedom's sake. And this is not just a minor philosophical quibble. It's emblematic of a completely different political vision, based in a different understanding of human nature, which has a very different justification for a post-capitalist society than what you would find in many leftist arguments today. The inability to choose a different first principle than freedom to guide one's political project is why socialists often find themselves competing with capitalism on capitalism's terms. Individual freedom was the centerpiece of many of the movements in the New Left. Yet this insistence on freedom as the highest good goes back to classical Marxism as well. Marxists and anarchists, despite their considerable disagreements about means and strategy, converge on freedom as the highest good. Yet what exactly the purpose of freedom was always a bit vague. Marxists and anarchists believe in freedom as the end goal, but often for different reasons. Marxists, insofar as they can even admit to having a moral position, often believe in freedom as a means to the realization of human potential. The collective freedom of all is necessary for the individual freedom of each. Marxists emphasize collective liberation as the necessary prerequisite for individual freedom, and ultimately strove for a communist future in which humans would be emancipated from virtually all constraints, a society of free association, in which there were no constraints except the ones agreed upon by the individuals themselves. The communist society advocated by Marxists was essentially a world without limits, a world without borders, a world without classes, a world without states. It was a society that would allow for, as Karl Marx put it, individuals to, quote, hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, and criticize after dinner, all without being defined by any single identity or role. Freedom from necessity, freedom from alienation, and freedom to choose one's destiny. This is the telos of the atheist communist project. It is above all predicated on the notion that the obstacles to man are not man himself, but the structures around man. Christians, however, tend to reject far leftist and ultra-progressive beliefs in a world without limits. The goal is not merely to deconstruct all of the orders that suppress human freedom, but to construct a moral order, not a utopian order not because it opposes freedom, but because it recognizes that unlimited freedom constitutes a philosophical and practical impossibility, because Christianity accepts humanity as inherently flawed and not something that can ever be perfected. Christians, like many other traditionalist groups, believe in human nature, and that human nature has a tragic and self-destructive component. That doesn't mean humans don't change throughout history and don't evolve as different conditions and different structures evolve, but rather there nevertheless exists certain universal tendencies in human nature across cultures and across time. The point of a Christian moral and economic order would be to contain the worst aspects of humanity, rather than merely liberate humanity from all its limits. Marx's theory rests on a fundamentally historicist anthropology that treats human nature as infinitely malleable, shaped entirely by historical material conditions and changing social structures. If humans currently exhibit greed, selfishness, and cruelty, this is because capitalism has made it so. It's not for them that capitalism has liberated the ability for humans to act on these pre-existing impulses. It is rather that capitalism forces humans to adapt in such a way to take on these characteristics that they might not otherwise have. Change the economic base, transform the relations of production, and human consciousness will follow. This is how many people take the logic of Marx's assertion that social being determines consciousness, rather than the reverse. The human being in this historical materialist framework is like clay to be molded by historical forces, with no fixed nature that persists across different modes of production. Anarchist theory shares this optimism. Anarchists, like Kropotkin, or libertarian socialist types in general, like Noam Chomsky, often argue how humans possess an innate tendency towards mutual aid and cooperation that capitalism actively suppresses. This is a tendency you find in a lot of progressive anthropology, which likes to emphasize the more egalitarian side of human nature, with many indigenous, local human tribes having rather egalitarian, even communistic forms of organization. Yet the other side of human nature, hierarchy, brutality, enslavement of other tribes, and the general tendency to see in-group solidarity and egalitarianism, but out-group aggression and conquest, is often understated. But it is common in general for most leftists to believe in Rousseau's dictum. The assumption of radical modern leftism, borrowed from Jean-Jacques Rousseau, one of the original pioneers of radical leftism, is that humans are born free, but everywhere are in chains. It is society that corrupts us, manipulates our desires, turns us into competitive, acquiescive individuals who lack solidarity, are atomized, and hostile. Liberation from these capitalist and statist structures will reveal our authentic cooperative nature. At least that's the idea, according to radical leftist visions. The assumption is that if you were to change the system, you would change the human. Christianity finds both positions naively utopian. Humans are intrinsically flawed, not just because of capitalism, or because of society, or because of the government. For humans created society. It is humans who rule the government. The market is not some alien imposition on humanity, but rather is an aggregation of individual choices, desires, and behaviors from humans that consume and produce according to supply and demand. When the market produces destructive outcomes, this is not merely because of structural dynamics, but because those structural dynamics channel and amplify pre-existing human tendencies and exploit them. The Christian insight is that you cannot change human nature merely by changing institutions, but rather that institutions and structures can certainly make human tendencies more or less destructive in their expression. We possess inherent entropic tendencies towards self-destruction that no amount of material abundance or structural transformation will eliminate. In some ways, it might even intensify them. The doctrine of original sin is not, as vulgar atheist critiques have suggested, some cosmic punishment for an ancestral apple theft. If one doesn't interpret Christianity like an autistic new atheist, one can find there is a great deal of allegorical value in it. The doctrine of original sin represents a sustained observation about human psychology and behavior across cultures and historical periods. The 7 deadly sins, pride, greed, lust, wrath, gluttony, envy, and sloth, aren't arbitrary prohibitions or moral platitudes, but rather are tendencies that, when unconstrained, lead to self-destruction. And these tendencies manifest regardless of the economic system we inhabit. Our choice is a matter of containing these tendencies, or intensifying these tendencies, at a scale. Christian moral philosophy understands limits as essential to virtue and human development. This is where the allegory of Satan becomes extremely relevant. Satan understood not in its literal demonology, but as a symbol of temptation and entropy. Temptation does not present itself as obviously harmful. We are not tempted by things that feel bad or are blatantly destructive. Temptation often comes dressed as pleasure, as fulfillment, promising the satisfaction of desire. What we want in the moment frequently conflicts with what we need for genuine flourishing. The Christian case for socialism isn't about giving people what they want, it's about giving people what they need. Sometimes giving people what they want is not always a good thing, because our desire is fleeting. Appetites can be insatiable, and what we desire in the short term can sometimes be detrimental for us in the long term. Sometimes we need to be protected from our own desires, to be protected from what we want, because our greatest desires can often destroy us. The goal is not a world without limits, but a world where limits are justly ordered to promote human flourishing, a moral order over the satanic anarchy of the market. Capitalism as systematized temptation. The satanic core of capitalism. Markets have existed throughout human history, but capitalism is unique in that it is a system where the market dominates society and where the objective of the state is to reproduce capitalist relations. And the reproduction of the state itself, its policy, design, and the politicians who wield it are heavily shaped by the capitalist mode of production and its class structures, which allow for the owners of capital to have a disproportionate amount of power than those who are full-time laborers, who are effectively blocked out of the democratic process, and have merely the ability to vote but not to meaningfully participate, let alone influence, the highly cartelized capitalist democracies that exist. I'm not against markets, and I don't even think that we should be fully against all capital. However, some socialists might agree or disagree to the extent to which capital should be prohibited or abolished. Rather, what I argue is that we should move towards a system where capital does not dominate society, where society is not subordinated to the needs of the market. Contemporary capitalism represents a system built on the systematization and monetization of temptation. This does not mean that we must get rid of capital. After all, according to Christianity, humans can never fully get rid of Satan. What is needed is balance. The capitalist system literally profits from exploiting the gap between what humans desire in the moment and what serves their long-term well-being. The whole industry of advertising, which Christians were some of the most adamant initial opponents against, manufactures artificial desires, creates addiction to substances, gambling, pornography, social media, and the monetization of addiction more broadly becomes a profitable business model that is neurologically tested to see if it can elicit as much dopamine as possible. In consumer capitalism, every insecurity, every psychological vulnerability, every moment of loneliness or anxiety becomes an opportunity for somebody to make a profit. The stagnant wages of the working majority of citizens is hidden by the deceptively cheap consumer products that we consume. It is not obvious how poor most people actually are because we are able to buy so many things for cheap. But cheap prices come at a price of another sort. The system hides our declining wealth by declining our health. Indeed, the whole food industry is rife with products that prioritize efficiency and lower production costs over the health of the people consuming it. So much of modern food contains excessive sugar along with other chemicals intentionally designed to make us more addicted to it. It is not a coincidence why America, the society in which consumer capitalism is the most advanced, has the highest obesity rate. The soul of man under consumer capitalism is fundamentally torn between the conflicting desires to consume as much as possible and to work as hard as possible, to enjoy and live one's best life, while also being as productive as possible and becoming as successful as possible. Because it is the market that determines human value, those on the lower end of the hierarchy have no one to blame but themselves, and are told that they are less valuable because they are objectively less valuable. according to the market. And as the system is held together through the promise of social mobility, people are not satisfied even as they climb up the ladder, as there is constantly people to compare themselves to. And once accustomed to higher standards of living, it is much harder to go down to lower standards of living, which leads to even people with a lot of money working more just to maintain their standard of living. Furthermore, what is problematized in all of this is the obsolescence of left and right, as political tendencies on the left and right function as ideological superstructures for the capitalist system, both rationalizing different aspects of it in various ways. As the imperatives of global capitalism make it harder to have a family, create communities, maintain stable friends, stable relationships, and stable jobs, the capitalist system commodifies this profound lack in alienation that it causes by commodifying human relationships and intimate experiences. Both forms of right-wing and left-wing liberal ideology come in to rationalize this process of decay. The right wing tells you that it's all about the individual and that you just need to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and that those who are more fortunate simply work harder, and that the problems in society are merely the outcasts of that society. Meanwhile, left-wing ideology, which might stand up for the outcasts and be a little bit more critical of those on the higher end of the hierarchy, liberal left ideology nonetheless rationalizes this process of decay by supporting forms of socially progressive ideology that in effect deregulate social life in such a way that allow for its marketization, by opposing all forms of religious and traditional morality, social norms, customs, and taboos, all in the name of progressive liberation and scientific advancement. It is why the new spirit of capitalism is profoundly liberal and feminine. It allows every sphere of the human experience to get absorbed into market logic. The rise of mental health that is immensely exacerbated by the decline of two-parent households, community, stable friendships, stable relationships, and stable jobs, along with the decline of religion that provides a form of cope and a haven in the heartless world. Progressive ideology comes in to destigmatize mental health, just so it can monetize it. It then presents the rise of mental health as merely the result of destigmatization and people being liberated to express themselves freely. It is why the left liberal side is more likely to promote therapeutic ideologies as solutions to the problems that the capitalist system causes. Oh, you're depressed because you have a completely dysfunctional family, can't find a stable job, provide for your family, or even have a family? Here, just go to therapy. Or have some pills, because you might have a neurological imbalance. Oh, and if you can't afford those, then here's an app. Social media platforms weren't what caused this problem, even if they exacerbate it. Rather, social media platforms came in response to this lack in order to profit from it. The system functions by identifying every human weakness and exploiting it for profit. Capitalism treats human beings merely as human resources, to be deployed for profit maximization. Workers are turned into appendages of a machine. It is often the case that even these self-made capitalists often become even more roboticized, not knowing what to do with all the money that they have except consume more and accumulate more power, as they have to adapt their humanity to the logic of the capitalist system in order to thrive in it. The system fundamentally subordinates human dignity, family bonds, communal ties, and environmental sustainability for the sake of endless economic growth, fundamentally destroying the very fabric of the fatherland of all our great nations. It is why it's not left versus right, but rather up versus down. On the right, you have conservatives willing to conserve nothing but the money in rich people's bank accounts, who aren't even conservative enough to conserve the very habitat of their motherland. Meanwhile, you have leftists who can hardly be distinguished from liberals who are obsessed with liberating every aspect of social life, which ends up amounting to the capitalist system just being able to profit from it more. As mentioned at the start of this essay, it has historically been people on the radical left, Marxists, anarchists, and socialists of various types, who have provided a structural critique of capitalism. Yet the limitation of even this is that this critique is often done solely on materialist grounds, and the materialism often ends up being vulgar in such a way that neglects things like culture, morality, and the material reality of morality itself. By this I mean the function that morality has in securing social order and protecting humans from their own worst impulses. These tendencies are often overlooked by forms of emancipatory politics that place freedom as the highest good, and reflexively dismiss any of these kind of moral arguments as outdated superstitions that they associate with dead traditions and religions that progressive ideology sought to overcome. Yet what they forget is that progressive ideology formed as a way of making capitalism more efficient. Progressive ideology, which people are fed in order to adapt to the demands of the capitalist system, inculcates dogmas that get people to assume that all kinds of traditional wisdom are merely dead relics of the past, the old age of mankind, which we are taught was unambiguously more oppressive. But G.K. Chesterton said it perfectly. Tradition is the democracy of the dead. Chesterton, the same man who said, "Do not ever take a fence down until you know why the reason it was put up," has been a big influence on this kind of thinking. This is not to say that we should or can go backward, but to question the presumption that progress itself is inherently good. Capitalism itself is progressive, but it's progressing us on a road to nowhere, a bleak post-human future. Marxists often assume that the capitalist superstructure will naturally change by itself after a revolution, as capitalism is abolished and socialism is gradually built. It is assumed that human nature will follow, or if you're an anarchist, that human nature already was socialistic the whole time. Some Marxists, who are a little bit more nuanced about the base and superstructure, have imagined all kinds of approaches towards establishing a socialist culture, a socialist new man. Yet they've been totally oblivious that this socialist culture that they're looking for was right in front of them the whole time, in the very religious tradition it had disavowed. Christianity is itself already socialist. What kind of socialism, or whether one wants to even call it socialism, is a matter of debate. But one thing is for sure, Christianity is not capitalist, in that it would not support a system in which capital and the market dominate all of human society. As C.S. Lewis articulated in works like Mere Christianity, the economic structure of a truly Christian society would have features that some might call socialistic. The theological term for elevating money and material accumulation above all other values is mammon worship. A system built on capital accumulation as its core organizing principle is built on serving mammon. It is, in the most precise theological sense, idolatry. Okay, next section. Limitarianism versus libertarianism. Freedom under capitalism does not serve any intrinsic meaningful purpose. And they try to tell you that this is liberating. You can find your own purpose. This is what the American dream is all about. And as George Carlin famously put it, you have to be asleep to believe it. We need to unlearn the libertarian ideology that sees any forms of limits or rules or norms as something inherently oppressive that should be opposed. Guardrails often exist and are often good because humans are prone to error, to lapses in judgment. Limits protect the possibility of reaching your destination. Limits protect you not just from destroying yourself, but allow for the possibility of you reaching your destination. So even if they might seem to restrict freedom in the short term, they can actually expand and improve freedom in the long term. This kind of freedom is especially needed in a capitalist gig economy world that is bent on self-enslavement and self-exploitation. A socialistic politics informed by Christian principles would seek to impose a moral order on the chaos induced by capitalism. But this order would not be an arbitrary order for order's sake. The kind of order that I'm interested in would be fundamentally skeptical towards arbitrary authority and the concentration of power. After all, it is constantly reiterated time and time again throughout the Bible that humans are equal under God and that no human authority is absolute. Therefore, power always needs to legitimate itself. A democratic socialist vision founded on Christian principles would be democratic politically and socialistic economically. If democracy is to mean anything, it would be the distribution of political power, not merely rule in the name of the people's interests. For plenty of false prophets and demagogues have claimed to rule in the people's interests and concentrate power for themselves. By socialistic, I mean the distribution of economic power, which I believe is crucial to avoid an order in which economic power is all in the hands of the state, in which the bureaucrats would merely be the new ruling class. The Christian vision isn't of equal wealth, but of a society where no one is so rich or so poor as to face the spiritual dangers of either extreme. Extreme wealth corrupts. This isn't a Marxist observation about ideology, but a psychological truth that everyone intuitively knows. Poverty isn't just bad because people don't get access to nice things. It poses deep spiritual dangers. when you can't feed your children, when eviction looms, when medical care is unaffordable, you face temptations towards desperation. You get pushed towards crime, prostitution, drug dealing. These things become rational responses to deprivation. Christian socialism would seek to construct a society where people are neither so rich that they lose their humanity, nor so poor that they lose their dignity. No human life shall be reduced to the existence of an animal, and no man's power shall be elevated to that of a god.
Vivienne.
We the noble, we the good, we the beautiful, we the happy. So the aristocrat evaluates himself. So he affirms himself. This beauty is his natural right, his default state, his inherited fortune. But that beauty comes at a cost, one typically borne by his ancestors. Beauty is no accident, in other words. Nietzsche's words from his Twilight of the Idols. Quote, "Even the beauty of a race or a family, the charm and benevolence of their whole demeanor is earned by labor. Like genius, it is the final result of the accumulated labor of generations." End quote. The supreme code of conduct for such labors, Nietzsche informs us, even when one is alone, one must not let oneself go. Quote, "One first has to convince the body, the strict maintenance of a significant and selective demeanor, an obligation to live only among men who do not let themselves go. This completely suffices for becoming significant and select." End quote. One must live amongst disciplined, civilized personages, in other words, and not such as those barbarians beyond the gate. Such civilized labors honor the god Apollo, who governs over those who labor in such a way, the far-seeing wolf god who wields the silver bow, he who aims his arrow at the goal, the lyricist god who signals order, the god of the plastic arts, in whose service one must not let oneself go. Now, man, of course, in his plural sense as a people, is a plastic medium. He can be shaped. The man who affirms himself, who defines the words good, noble, beautiful, and happy by himself, such a man can shape himself into a family by taking on a wife from amongst his equals, bearing with her children who will inherit his good fortune in many, if not all senses of the word. Such a man can and does wield his artist's hammer against the plastic masses and shape those who will obey him into a people. This family breeds selectively. Such principles of breeding, the venerable rules of family life, as Nietzsche calls them in Birth of Tragedy, turn out noble, healthy, and beautiful children, generation after generation after generation, until they don't anymore. Even a noble family decays when the spark of life of a given family begins to sputter on its long journey down the family line. Eventually, the order no longer bears up, and the tide of erotic chaos known to us through Nietzsche as Dionysus overwhelms the degenerating hierarchy structure, the polis, built by such long and careful discipline as was embodied in the noble family. Then the Apollonian veil falls. Behind it, the concealed one, the great tempter god, the Pied Piper of conscience whose pipes lure the young women outside the walls of the city, beyond the reach of the laws of men, beyond the carefully structured rules of breeding, heeded so dogmatically now by men who no longer have the strength to legislate and can only cling to the borrowed valor of ancestors with whom they really no longer share any kinship. his voice, it is Dionysus of whom I speak, descends into the netherworld of the Maenad's soul, down beneath the thoughts she thinks in words given meaning by men who have long since passed, down beneath the careful ordering of the rank hierarchy, whose noble caste has decayed and is now flinging away its rights. The Maenad steps toward Dionysus, and he draws her another step farther away, his silent will lassoed around her heart and drawing her deeper into her own desire, the voiceless tide of his magnetism quieting the worry that chastises her in the voice of her father, her mother, her grandparents, and theirs, the voice that reminds her that she is a commodity to be sold in exchange for political control, sold to a man who will never make the waters in her pelvis flow. The Maenad reaches instead towards Dionysus, hesitantly, and he smiles at her, bestowing his yes upon her willingness, the sun that makes her yearning grow fast and sinuous like vines erupting from the dark earth, quick and reaching, lush and grasping, ripe and fruiting grapes. The Maenad is full of a hope that has no name. A child gestates within her now, bewildered, an heir without inheritance, except whatever the god will give him as the due to his mother's courage. She has risked her very life to conceive him, not only beyond the comfort of the city walls and her father's halls, but in direct, if unintentional, defiance to the pointed end of all the weapons that serve to keep this very tide from rushing in. This tide for which she has spread her legs without thinking. This swell from the chthonic depths to which she has let herself go. She disobeys the moldering and brittle laws of men, for so they have become, even if they were not always so. But she obeys something, nevertheless, the call of the wild, the will of the new life that will flow into becoming through her womb, the seed of the barbarian, who will now threaten the city from both without the gates and from within. She defies the traditions encoded in religion, of her ancestors here, yes, but she is nevertheless sanctified, if under the auspices of a new and foreign god amongst his vital, barbaric cult followers. Degenerate times call for new cults, and cults, like all things, recycle eternally. Rank order is, you see, determined erotically, which means that if no one within the city walls can make the Maenad flow, then those men also no longer bear the right to rule, which was undeniably once conferred on them by fortune as sons and heirs of other gods, gods who too have perhaps become tired and need a rest, who shall be plowed under after Ragnarok and seed the earth to be born again. Gods too eternally recur. Everything dies and is born anew. This is the very good news. The cult of Dionysus is the cult of exuberance, of excess energy, of that which overflows. Literally, it is the cult of sacred feminine waters which break the levees and flood. It is the cult of arousal. It is the cult of the eternal joy of becoming, even where becoming means that the highest virtues and persons, even all the mastery of the well-ordered city and carefully structured and inherited wealth, must and will be destroyed by the oncoming tide of the overwhelming feeling of life and energy which the mischievous god Dionysus brings on bull back and panther paw, with blood-drunk night dancing and howling at the moon. Good families are born from such reckless abandon. Beauty is no accident, perhaps, not in the Apollinian sense, but sometimes it is an accident, like Dionysus is an accident. Sometimes the gods just lightning strike beauty into a man, a vital man, a newborn family in one body, a freshly made beginning, an exception, a far-flung outlier. And such a man can seed a new kingdom, a new people, into a Maenad on the forest floor, blood-streaked in naked moonlight and crying. Good families are also destroyed in these rites, of course, where strangers and barbarians inseminate the daughters of old families and bring all of that over which the family has labored for generations straight to ruin. The secret to affirming this is to realize, to feel, that tragedy is joyful, that Dionysus and Apollo will persist in dynamic tension, ruling over realms and peoples who destroy each other in fatal attractions, and who conceive ever-renewing life through bloodletting and barefoot running and tearing apart the city's favorite sons from limb to limb to limb. Dionysus ultimately determines the order of rank because he rules the Maenad, and he determines who she chooses and how she chooses. Not rationally, not prudently, not carefully, but from intoxicated and mindless abandon that thinks from and only with her holy womb. Not who is chosen for me, but who does my body choose. Dionysus is the will to power, and he determines the rank order and is determined anew in each cyclic turning of creating and destroying passion. Dionysus overwhelms the polis and lays waste to the city people. He grows grapes from the compost of those ruins. He inseminates new life that will build what he will again destroy by the Maenad's retarded, mindless, entirely imprudent, and perfectly holy desire for the nameless wild beyond the crumbling city gates. May you rest well in this season of dark closeness and cold. May the structures around you keep you safe and warm. May you enjoy your inheritance and your families. The spring is coming when everything thaws, and Dionysus will be waiting for us all. Merry Christmas.
Mynaa Miesnowan.
Man, party animal, political animal, conspiratorial animal. Here we arrive at Christmas, of which its season and celebrations are perhaps the most clear result of the myth or hallucination of history. Sedimentary layers of archaic and modern conspiracy that become normal in real time, yet invisible as to be apparent within the fabric of a culture's existence. Hang the lights, trim the trees, conduct the rituals. You can't have culture without cult, and cult is a set of connections via shared feelings and interpretations or sensations of beings taken quite literally and acted upon. I say history is mythical here, since it arrives like all myth, the gods themselves, outside of oneself, so the questions of, is it real or did it really happen, become secondary and irrelevant to the inevitable and ultimate consequences drawn. Similar to how one might entertain or try to understand someone else's views and values, the least interesting, least relevant question to ask is this true? Like appearance or perception in its hallucination or projection, one takes it as true to even begin to think and act, and the question is instead, how is this true? What is truth in its conspiracy or methods of arriving there does not rank on these scales. Myth is everywhere and timeless. Reverse engineering is the only way in for the animal who can only project, of which we can say, man's personality and projections, joy and fear, all of it steeped in desire, have always clashed within himself and outside with others, intentionally, unintentionally, because conspiracy doesn't happen alone. Its very nature is relational. One doesn't have to even understand conspiracies to be wrapped up in them, and the same could be said of hallucinations. Set out milk and cookies, place the Christmas gifts under the tree, listen to the cat scratch the scratching post. Family is another myth, and also it has its own conspiracies from cradle to the grave and beyond. There's good reasons we moderns would eschew politics conspiracy, especially at the holiday dinner table, but the pagans discerned many gods of the home for nothing ever left. It's all there, ready to get out or in, but there's no controlling or pretending like these spirits are not present. Repression itself is its own need, has its own consequences. Please do discuss contentious everythings at the table and enjoy yourselves, but remember, it's always a matter of argument until someone attempts to put an end to it. How do you now insist on the right to be right, or moral? Between the felt necessities or instincts of man and his own desired self-perception, that is, how he wants to see himself, it's clear that the man who projects indeed wants himself to be seen in very particular light by others, as if he means something, as if he matters, and communicates to be understood. It is most sagely and saintly. Man wants to be seen as a reflecting surface, like a many-faceted jewel out from which his light might shine clarity on all things. Not everyday or average aspiration, really. The work of genius which I'd never ask or expect anyone and everyone to understand, despite the conspiracies that are all leveled towards organizations of education, religion, and their priesthoods or corporations, farming the lowest common denominators. But this obsession with being at the center of things was called by Zarathustra immaculate perception, to be as if a perfect mirror. Nietzsche is again describing himself here, and as for the namesake of the holiday at hand, not Santa but Jesus, he suffered from this. To quote Zarathustra in his time, this love affair with the moon will soon come to its end. But why? Because there are no facts, only interpretations. This doesn't mean one way, one truth, a final answer to end all problems, or the deus ex machina, and instead opens up abysses of perception to infinite interpretations, to begin all problems anew. Good luck to anyone so greedy as to speak here with finality, but this love affair with the moon has always draped its lust in holiness. The Savior, for instance, wanted to be right at the cost of truth eternal to come, even if by modern standards Jesus' philosophical and political work doesn't stand up to rigor at all. And no, this doesn't concern an examination of a decaying church and even the world it polices, imprisons, and devours, nor is this some comparison of scientific versus religious thinking. Rather, there could be believers in churches for thousands more years to come, and they will still be hanging wreaths, wearing dresses and hats, and conducting whatever ceremony comes next. Whether inside or outside the cult, it's clear one's self-perception is rooted, stuck, in limb and league with others. One at least tries to see oneself in the best light, the correct light, the right light, hoping others do the same. As the saying goes, quote, memory says, I did that. Pride replies, I couldn't have done that, end quote. Pride wins. Turns out I'm still pretty cool. Between these feats of memory, pride, and happy forgetfulness, Nietzsche christens a higher history out of the voids of seeing and the abyss of Christian nihilism, which is inseparable from its techno-feudal industrial powerhouse government productions and the totalitarian principle behind their idealism and its monotheistic consequences. Being at war with everyone and thing, being at war with the future, a gentle euthanasia, retiring into juvenile attitudes, youthful cynicism and decadence, or a pointless, aimless, meaningless existence, ushered in by the bloodiest century in history, a brave new world indeed christened by the will to power. Man tires of war, man tires of man tires of himself. The tragedy isn't the consequences, it's a world of slavery pretending, hoping, idealizing anything but what is, selling hope like dope, and for what? What connects the low to the high here? What is the cost in the wager? Winner takes all, the devaluing of value in a system of nihilistic moralism, massive corporate cults protected by military and joined to run a bland culture of advertising and markets on a machinic logic which includes treating people like idiots and machines used up in service to bitter ends as a mere means to an end, generally accounting, watching the numbers skyrocket until they explode. Yes, war is a means of averting suicide, and war also becomes an all-encompassing psychological compensation. The bow is loosened. Morality is frozen on the battlefield. There is no being human or humane in an inhumane and humanless society. That doesn't mean anything was lost or taken away. Rather, it's closer to mass delusion, denial, sickness, what happens when frozen or in stasis. If not death, immensely reduced metabolism and an inability for an organism to digest. Frozen, neotness for being so old. Perhaps an ideal state for man is a historic beast with or without a soul, which is a primordial animal lost to the void of a perpetual now, a perfect inhabitant of an anti-intellectual, post-literate, post-truth culture, those who lost their high hopes and inner hero. Man then liberated from history, what he was and is and could hope to be, blown apart somewhere near World War I and World War II. But I don't think this destruction of old Europe and history itself is the real catastrophe that Nietzsche saw as impending and inseparable from his name. Rather, that would instead be the complete domination and taming of the animal man, his world a zoo filled with museums and other sepulchres honoring the vanquished where life is ensured to happen no longer. The world is finally safe, frozen, dissected, transparent. This is man robbed of his political being, and conspiracies, or organizing for power, is illegal wherever you go, not limited to the Western world, mind you. Individualism in the manners of saviors and heroes mythology and its noble lie provide the perfect cover for something much more insidious than mere egomania, something much darker that slouched this way to be born. No, not the end of man or his world. That would probably be more ideal to those who need idealism. This isn't a critique of individualism. Rather, people are totally free, disconnected, unmoored, and encouraged to be individuals precisely because the individual no longer has a bearing or meaning on history or to mankind. No one is indispensable, the seat supposedly matters rather than who is in it, and people should not take themselves seriously or as important. I don't mean serious as in without humor, I mean instead valuing oneself. Perhaps we can call it the luxury of self-belief. Worth noting, if legacy and lineage or heredity mean nothing, then man can mean nothing because heredity or relations are what man is, in one of few ways somebody finds out who they really are, by way of encountering others. The apocalypse is not on the horizon. It came and went. This is the post-eschatological world Zarathustra descends to. It's been very busy since he climbed his mountain. He arrives in an alien yet familiar land, its collapse being total, not just internal, but environmental. Despite so many things and peoples being shaken apart everywhere, the meaning and value of things are so apparent to the inhabitants you'd have to be an idiot or a fool to bother asking or contesting. Yet for so much simple clarity and a nihilistic self-obsessed purview, the irony is neither enervating nor energizing, rather it is flat, not even sadly funny. Make us into this last man, Zarathustra, cries the marketplace, the home of the herd. 2,000 years later, and the crowd again cries, Barabbas, give us Barabbas. The tragedy complete as it begins, well before it ends. That is, these last men watch their cultures, identities, nations, states, ways of life dissolve or erupt, devolve into slavery, and at best, they can make themselves the butt of their joke, at Zarathustra's expense, mind you. So it is to attempt to put someone aside. To everybody, a noble one standeth in the way. Laughter is sacred, but the truth is that of understanding. You get the joke rather than merely guffawing or parroting it back. Man is moldable, disposable, not indispensable, yet interchangeable object is hilarious. It doesn't leave you trembling or full of resentment and contempt, and in its release, the most deadly oppositions of life come to the foreground, enframed in their utmost suffering, broken up in spasm of conscious mockery. Tending to it, rather than, say, kicking a dead dog, are not the same thing. Rather than assuming everything is so familiar, in line with his teachings of both what to learn and unlearn, Zarathustra instead sees everything as in the air, frozen there, verily, open to a flood of terrible monsters and abysses, and where is seeing, not seeing, abysses. Inhuman All Too Human, one of the most profound works of psychology ever penned, Nietzsche states this new world came about as a total estrangement from an older mythological world. As Nietzsche reviews this work in his autobiography Ecce Homo, he doesn't say Christianity and idealism is gone or disappearing. He even knows Christianity and its idealism are not refuted. Rather, it's on ice. It is freezing. Everyone bundles up for the cold. Christmas is still celebrated. With the depths of winter fast approaching, the political animal Zarathustra seeks his people, his polis, his conspiracy. He involves himself in everything that nobody else will. Quote, I pick up what falls from the tables of your repast, end quote. And as a satire of man, he walks among men as among animals. This isn't the kind of cynicism and world weariness you can hear and smell in the sermons and characters in the story, which is a sketch and story of modern or postmodern man. the gray-haired youth described in Untimely Meditations, wrapped up tight with the spider and the mesh of the world net. Zarathustra is instead sincerely moved to the point of utmost and furthest concern with man and his future. He makes it a point to give all he can, even though he technically obtains nothing from it except death, and in the most profound human psychologist to exist, in his deep isolation, he knows this is his fate and he can hope for nothing else. Who could laugh in such a serious situation? An old parable states, "This world has always been said to be on fire." Illustrated in the story of Zarathustra, the tightrope walker was already on his way, a dangerous crossing, a rope over the abyss, a punny take on Aristotle. But it was really the buffoon who begins the race, after which history itself dies en route, and it's only by Zarathustra's association with this dying tightrope walker that, as the fool returns to warn him, was his saving grace, his relationship to the dead dog. History is not just a beloved or spiteful projection. It's far more powerful. A dangerous looking back, as Zarathustra calls it. Looking forward, where the future sneaks up from behind, is looking into the rear view. This is not looking at the past, but instead a glimpse of what is to come. With or without such vision, it seems improbable that anyone would or could write a profound historically referential text to consciously compete with the Bible as work of literature that informs a people's experience and therefore identity. Perhaps even more ambitious is to compete with Christ as teacher, hero, elevation, and resurrection of the right order, who comes next in proper lines of succession. But this is where the war of superior values is always waged, a noble one in the way. Quote, "To speak truth and be skillful with bow and arrow, so seemed it alike pleasing and hard to the people from which cometh my name, the name which is alike pleasing and hard to me. Rest in peace, history, literacy, and man. Everything dissolves, everything is permitted. Everyone can and does learn from Zarathustra, just as Zarathustra learns from the people, including the God-man or the man-God. In the span of the New Testament, there's only something like 6,000 or 7,000 words, and only a portion of those belong to Jesus. As with older new texts alike, it suffers being open to interpretation by anybody, but that's secondary to a scant story with appeals to justice with good psychological reasons or compensations, and just plain wrong projections and assumptions, yet offers little to the living, while seemingly penned as a screed to the hopeless and damned, finally turned into desperate politicking with the likes of Paul, the hope of the condemned and those smitten stupid by the roadside, on their way to kill someone else, no less. The story's real timelessness isn't its originality or parables or even its tragedy turned comedy, but that it's mythological by nature, not that it spells the truth, of which we can say is informed by the Greeks, especially where Christ appropriates plot lines from Dionysus' story. In contrast to the baffling philosophy and moral stick-shaking of the New Testament, Zarathustra offers spirited discourses, conscious scrutiny of the self, curses, encouragement, belief in heroism, and laughter in the course of many passages, pages, and events depicted therein. Seemingly vague, purple, poetic, but all too clear, meant to be read as literal facets of our world, allegory melting into literary masterpiece and symbology in many cases. Washed-up scholars, resentful tarantulas, the cold idol of the state, the increasingly powerless old-fashioned priest or intellectual classes, the displacement of royalty and the destruction of social orders and communities who can no longer carry on as they once did, or take themselves or their existence seriously as actors in a cosmic plot. Belief and faith have nothing to do with it any longer. Gone is hope, fled is heroism. Zarathustra speaks to all the actors here, and even the spectators who behave as actors, the myriad stratum of classes of people in this flux. Men, women, soldiers, scholars, priests, artists, youths, his own disciples, kings, and other assorted madmen. He rules nobody out insofar as he takes the world and those in it as they reveal themselves. He sees the terrible necessity for those hanging on the edge of the abyss at the center of the circle, and within there is a heartfelt commiseration with others, especially when it comes to loss and dealing in Zarathustra's latest and hottest of virtues, uprightedness. Quote, "As deeply as man looks into life, he looks into suffering. Not pity like Christ, but understanding, even friendship. Slaves can't be friends and tyrants can't have friends, of which we can say many philosophers and wise men have been antisocial hybrids of the two, making them largely professors or perhaps wailing prophets, or as the story goes in Zarathustra, the saint in the wilderness who says he does not love man. Quote, 'I bring a sword,' end quote, spoke the Savior. But it's Christmas, Jesus. Don't you have anything nice to say? Not really, though he is lovable for being a great despiser. But if the Old Testament's God's real and foremost name was wrath, then the New Testament's God's name wasn't only pity, but just as fatal. It is a God of rejection, denial, refusal, resentment, naysaying and slandering the earth, to wit, sour grapes, blood as wine that sickens those who imbibe, contagious, similar to laughter, the imitation of a happy man. Our culture's wider cynicism here, relating to both religion and also happiness and laughter, makes perfect sense, because someone who smiles or laughs, especially without good reason, is seen as a fool. Another way to say it is, a fool is someone who is not properly afraid, and yes, qualify afraid how you or they will. It's found in moral education, what is appropriate to desire or not desire, so on and so forth. Splitting from this past, yet keeping its main through lines, Zarathustra writes a new font of wisdom and folly. Whether this finds you today or tomorrow or 100 or 1,000 years in the future, I'm curious as to the development of those who seek and find and interpret these texts. Art is a people, family is a people is what they are, and a people want to be what they are. Anything else veers into mass programming operations, domestication, factory farming, really, instructions for the supernumerary and condemned. Nietzsche feared becoming seen as a holy man and wrote he'd rather be seen as a clown, which is something hilarious to record for posterity or the ages. As it is, people are both too dumb and too intelligent to be concerned with any of this, which is mythical, yet tangible, real. Self-perception must be rooted in how we are to be seen by others, and relations speak to familial bonds, necessities, desires, drives for both immortality and power, being that such things are impossible without a lineage, a succession, a family. Nietzsche criticizes the marriages of Christianity and poses the question, and how many of you actually deserve to have a child? Laugh not at such marriages. What child hath not had reason to weep over its parents? Speaking broadly, the Heavenly Father and His Son are no different. A world story drama of resentment, rejection, teeth-gnashing, backstabbing, frozen in nihilism. Once limited to the Kierkegaards, the French, Nietzsche before them and others, the hushed and underground concerns of existentialism, nihilism, even psychology are deluged through the streets, the news of the airwaves. Eventually, what was once unacceptable thinking and acting, conspiracy, is now socially acceptable mannerisms, habits, ways of seeing, and ways of life. Materialism and greed hiding behind the spiritual. Everyone generally wants more than they have and takes more than they give, and if they have more, it's because God sanctioned it so. In other words, even entitlement is mythological, and they want to be paid besides. Quoting Zarathustra, they crucify the whole human future. Regardless, Zarathustra also welcomes the new breeds, which is to say the old breeds, to come out of hiding. Rather, he says there will be nowhere to hide. You can suppose he means there's no hiding from the excessive self-consciousness now opened up in the individual, let alone the collective psyche. There's no escaping the vibrating webs of the world spider's net, the wills of others, and others more still. Thrash against the movement, but the silk holds fast. On a related thread, in his essay Self-Reliance, Ralph Waldo Emerson expresses the following, which is shortened for our purposes here. Quote, "This one fact the world hates, that the soul becomes, for that forever degrades the past, turns all riches to poverty, all reputation to shame, confounds the saint with the rogue, shoves Jesus and Judas equally aside." We fancy it rhetoric when we speak of eminent virtue. We do not yet see that virtue is height and that a man or a company of men, plastic and permeable to principles, by the law and nature must overpower and ride all cities, nations, kings, rich men's poets who are not. Nietzsche, considering belief in morality of the past, said that much was thought evil that was actually quite mild, as if to say you haven't seen real evil yet. The devil, even in all his trickery, isn't scary anymore. Terrorists and insane people and military police forces and nuclear bombs and sophisticated forms of slavery and total control, monitoring and domination of the mind and body are far scarier than the Prince of Darkness. And if God, Jesus, Satan, and all men and heroes since are no longer sufficient to move, uplift, inspire, guide, and encourage man, who then is left? What great noble spirit shall carry on consciously what man once followed blindly? To inflict oneself on others is, in one way or another, is not necessarily a bad thing. Nietzsche had the answers once more. I am describing myself, and also, I love it when another thinker overpowers me. Related then that Weakness, paranoia, and insecurity are contagious and dangerous, which is precisely what has been the biggest boon to those civilization and state-shaping forces, those domesticating forces known as orders of religion, education, capital, hierarchy, the social group, now advertising and public relations and still hierarchy, status and rent-seeking behaviors and rituals engaged and dispersed among many circles and orders of relations or groups of local intelligences, and of those you can't call them cultures or civilizations, but simply groupings, comes now a new constellation, the birth of the super dragon, and people still think they know good and evil and are to retire to rest besides? That's a question mark right there. Many more still idealize and rail and rant against the way the world is, the way people are. And who here is courageous enough to accept their fate with a smile? And if there's nothing to hope for, does this make all smiles and laughter foolish then? Bravery is worth more than suffering, and if hope is only for the hopeless or desperate or unhappy anyway, who can shut up and say earnestly, hey, this is nice. Nice Christmas tree, nice cats, nice supper, nice conspiracy. There's no saving anyone, and if so, they'd have to figure it out for themselves to even begin with, simply because they have to. Zarathustra mocks and rejoices here. Quote, this crown of the laughter, this rose garland crown, I myself have put on this crown. I myself have consecrated my laughter. No one else have I found today potent enough for this. End quote. What follows is fatality, destiny, the truth of no mere buffoon, but a grand fool, and framed above in naming the consecration of his laughter. Zarathustra proclaims, quote, thus will I die myself, that ye friends may love the earth more for my sake, and earth will I again become, to have rest in her that bore me. Verily, a goal had Zarathustra. He threw his ball. Now be ye friends and heirs of my goal. To you I throw the golden ball. Best of all, do I see you, my friends, throw the golden ball. Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and happy be whatever it is you celebrate. Cheers.
The family's just finished decorating the Christmas tree, and they've hung their stockings by the fireplace.
In 1963, a song came out that I'm sure all of you have heard. It's the Most Wonderful Time of the Year, written by Edward Pola and George Weil and recorded by Andy Williams. If you've ever paid attention to the lyrics of this song, you may have found yourself perhaps puzzled by one of the lines found in the verse, quote, there'll be parties for hosting, marshmallows for toasting, and caroling out in the snow. There'll be scary ghost stories and tales of the glories of Christmases long, long ago, end quote. Now, we certainly still engage in the traditions of hosting parties and Christmas caroling. In fact, some neighborhood Christmas carolers just came through the other night, although I live in Texas, so they weren't exactly out in the snow, but, the spirit was there. I don't know how many people toast marshmallows on Christmas. That's more of a campfire thing these days. People don't really roast chestnuts on an open fire much anymore either. But all the same, there's nothing puzzling about these traditions. Warm treats and a warm fire have always been a part of Christmas celebrations in whatever form that they take. It's the part about ghost stories that I think is somewhat odd, because that type of thing tends to be associated with Halloween rather than Christmas. Now, of course, A Christmas Carol by Dickens remains a perennial favorite for the season, which is a story involving several ghosts who visit Ebenezer Scrooge on Christmas Eve. We all know the story. Scrooge is a miser. He's judgmental. He has no humanity, no care for other people. He's totally self-centered. He has no love for the spirit of Christmas. In fact, Christmas and other such holidays are just an annoyance to him. It's an interruption to doing business. Through seeing his past, present, and future, Scrooge undergoes a kind of transformation. In the morning, he's a changed man. He's now filled with the spirit of Christmas. He becomes generous, caring, and so on. This transformation is affected by Scrooge having self-reflected. A mirror, so to speak, is held up to the kind of person he is, to the kind of life he's living. He sees why he is the way he is. He sees the effect of his actions, the effect they have on others in the here and now, and he sees the effect that his actions will have in the future, where his future is leading him. And the horror is that it's leading him to the grave, yes, but we all go to the grave. The real horror of Scrooge's future that he sees is that no one will really care when Scrooge dies, just as he doesn't seem to care about the condition of his fellow human beings. But other than A Christmas Carol, are there really any other ghost stories that we tell? A Christmas Carol is a cultural artifact that's being referenced in these lyrics. What we have in Dickens' story is simply the most significant and most enduring story that comes out of a now dead tradition from Victorian England. Some scholars have traced this practice all the way back to pagan traditions associated with Yule. It's a time of year characterized by long nights and harsh conditions. During such times, the old European pagans would gather around the fire on cold nights and tell stories. Regardless of the origins of the tradition, the Victorian era saw a renewed interest in this tradition, a rekindling of it. These English Victorians would gather around the hearth and tell ghost stories. Scholars have various opinions about how to interpret this phenomenon. It could be perhaps an expression of Victorian anxieties about modernity and industrialization and so on. And so it's sort of like plunging into the old superstitions as a kind of romantic reaction against the march of history. Or else maybe there was a rising popularity of this tradition because of the interest in spiritualism and mediums and so on. I mean, this is the era where the ghost story as we know it today is basically created. The key figures in this storytelling tradition were Dickens and M.R. James, with A Christmas Carol as the obvious choice for Dickens. For James, perhaps they might read something like, "Oh, whistle, and I'll come to you, my lad." Perhaps some of them read tales by Algernon Blackwood, one of the pioneers of the weird fiction genre, tales such as The Willows or The Kit Bag. The tradition continued into the early 1900s, but it was already dying out by the turn of the century. By the time It's the Most Wonderful Time of the Year was released in the early 1960s, hardly anyone was telling these ghost stories on Christmas anymore. And so this lyric harkens back to the rituals of a bygone era. It was a bygone era even when the song was written, just as the Victorians were perhaps looking back to a bygone era of Yuletide rituals. The reason why I wanted to talk about this old practice of telling ghost stories at Christmas is because I think this tradition should come back. And the reason why I think they should come back is that stories like A Christmas Carol more powerfully express the message of Christianity than the normal platitudes associated with this season. We hear a lot about, for example, family, the importance of family during Christmas. What did Jesus have to say about the importance of family? He said he came to set parents against children, husbands against wives. I mean, that's not to be taken literally, but it's a statement that Christ came for everyone, and that the distinctions between human beings are to be done away with in Christ, including familial loyalty. In Christ, there's no male and female. There's no husband and wife. There's no father and son, because all are brothers in Christ. Christ didn't come for one family or one people or one nationality, but for all nations, all families. Scrooge, for instance, is not transformed into someone who understands the importance of family, but into someone who recognizes the basic worth and dignity and humanity of people who are in no way related to him. In fact, I think if we self-reflect on this, it's rather easy to see the value in one's own family. When you're just sort of gathering together as a family, buying gifts for one another within your own household, sharing a feast with one another, there's nothing that really pushes you out into the world to look after all those other brothers and sisters of Christ if Christmas is just about family gathering together. Another platitude bandied about concerning Christmas is that it involves the spirit of giving. And I will certainly not say that giving or charity is not a Christian virtue. It absolutely is. But how often does this platitude simply end up reproducing the spirit of consumer capitalism? The gift-giving ritual associated with Christianity in America is harnessed for economic ends, whatever the good intentions might be behind it. The vast majority of people don't interpret the spirit of giving during Christmas as an injunction to go work in a soup kitchen. Certainly some do, but for most of us, the spirit of giving means, again, to purchase some plastic knick-knack for every member of your family and to receive a share of plastic worthless knick-knacks yourself, probably made in China, the lot of them. Many of us end up getting things we don't want or need, and we spend money we don't have or wouldn't ordinarily spend, and it creates a feeding frenzy of economic activity. And on the other hand, how often do we really hear that the spirit of Christmas ought to be a spirit of self-reflection? Well, this theme is there. It's there in A Christmas Carol. It's there in It's a Wonderful Life. But I would argue that this is sort of a marginal message or virtue that is spoken of during Christmas time. I think it's actually unusual when if you just talk to people about what they like about Christmas. Most of them are going to talk about time with family, big meals, sort of the sensory, aesthetic experiences of Christmas. Very rarely are you going to hear them say, oh, Christmas is a time to take stock of our own mortality, to contemplate mortality and the world after this one, take stock of our actions, reconsider where our path is taking us, remind ourselves that this world is only a veil and there's a spiritual world behind it, to remind ourselves of the finality of our lives, the fact that we have limited time to do what we have to do on this earth, to become what we wish to become. I would argue not often. People don't often speak in these terms. Even the religious symbolism, and this makes sense that this is the religious symbolism, but it's all about the nativity, the coming of the Savior. Often the sermon or the homily on Christmas is just about, just rejoice that the Savior's come. But shouldn't a true Christian also take stock of what his Savior demands of him? Ask himself whether he's really lived up to the demand. In other words, there's obviously a good news to the story of Christianity and a good news being celebrated in the Christmas season. But that comes in Christianity with a moral demand, with a duty with a responsibility that is imparted to the followers of Christ. On this show, we have spent a lot of time talking about Christianity, and perhaps one of the most favorable things I can say about it, although it's by no means an unqualified good, is that Christianity has made mankind self-conscious in a more profound way than he previously was. This is, by the way, Nietzsche's criticism of Christianity, or one of the many criticisms. But I'd say it's a core criticism that this self-consciousness is achieved by doing a kind of violence to the self in the form of bad conscience. That guilt is cruelty directed inward. But if we set Nietzsche's valuations about this aside for a moment and assume the values of Christianity as good, then we would have to see value in self-reflection, in bringing ourselves into consciousness, bringing our actions and our path in life into consciousness to the greatest degree possible. Perhaps the most Christian way to approach Christmas is in this spirit of self-reflection, rather than these platitudes about family or giving that are in theory positive, but are in practice usually self-centered and in many ways negative. And I think the reason why this might be, or one of the reasons, is that the holiday of Christmas is associated with all sorts of things that are really not in that self-reflective spirit. We've already talked about having treats and gathering around a fire. Christmas is a time of feasting, of treating yourself, of, well, indulgence. It's a time also of ostentatious displays, Christmas lights and lawn ornaments, parades and parties. So not only are we encouraged to give to others, but also to give to ourselves, to indulge ourselves by eating a lot of food, maybe getting a bit drunk, dancing, showing off. Maybe it's not good to be gluttonous and drunk in normal times, but it's a holiday. Let yourself go, live a little, right? And that reminds me, that conception of what a holiday is, reminds me much less of Christ than it does of Dionysus. And I think this kind of insight would not be lost on the early Christians, the apostolic Christians, who were not only opposed to dating the birthday of Jesus and celebrating it. I mean, one of the sources, I learned this from Neil, Gnostic Informant's channel, one of the sources actually says the whole astrological system of finding out when somebody's birthday was and then celebrating that day, that's a pagan practice. That's what some of the early Christians said. That, the whole idea of celebrating a birthday comes from the Egyptian pharaohs and all of these things. And, what matter is it to us Christians? The Savior has come. Every day we live with Christ and the Holy Spirit, right? But also just the general spirit of feasting and indulging yourself. That was the manner of religiosity of the pagans that they generally opposed. Veronica Grimm's book, From Feasting to Fasting, documents this shift. The early Christians did not share this Dionysian attitude. Their conception of holidays, literally holy days, was not about feasting and being merry. If anything, at the holiest of times, you should be living more simply as an ascetic, thinking of others, thinking of actually giving away and not indulging yourself, denying yourself indulgences. Now, obviously, this attitude changed, and feast days and such holidays were a huge part of Christianity in the Middle Ages, and even within a couple of centuries, the whole opposition to dating Christ's birth and celebrating it, that completely changed. Obviously, Christmas has been a holiday among Christians for a very, very long time. But the earliest immigrants to America, the Puritans, had represented a resurgence of this early Christian spirit. Famously, the Puritans banned Christmas decorations. They banned Christmas celebrations. They considered it all to be inappropriate and unseemly. To them, Christmas should be just that, the Mass of Christ. The time to remember his birth, be thankful for your spiritual salvation. It's not a time to be wasteful and excessive. Now, obviously, the Puritans were only one sect among many. Their attitude towards Christmas can be understood through their attitude towards life in general. They had a famous work ethic. They had this attitude of saving rather than spending. They had a praise of productivity and simplicity of living. But I think it's hard to deny that they've identified a real incongruity. The way that the birth of Jesus is often celebrated actually better resembles a pagan holiday than a Christian one. When most people talk about the influence of paganism on Christianity, it's not normally what they talk about, right? They identify these other things, the imagery, the trappings. Oh, Santa Claus. We call him St. Nicholas, but he's inspired by Father Yule in his appearance. Or the Christmas tree. Other such iconic symbols of Christmas find their roots in European paganism. But the question, I suppose, is whether it is significant that pagan symbols are used or whether pagan practices are indulged in. And I think you could take away all of the symbols with a pagan origin, and Christmas would still be a fundamentally Dionysian holiday in terms of how it's practiced. It's a feasting holiday. It's an excessive holiday, a holiday in which one drinks and is simply merry and carefree in the moment, where they spend time with their own little kin group with their family. Very few people are pushed out into charity for the broader world, right? That's not the way Christmas is currently practiced in America. These excesses, these indulgences, if you actually care about Christian values, you can't see them as just a harmless romp. There are desires that are seized on by consumerism in order to serve Mammon. Even the appearance of Santa Claus is less pagan than it is a product of the Coca-Cola company's rebranding of the figure. That's why he always appears in red and white. So many families gather around the television to watch the parades and pageantry sponsored by major corporations. People go and raid the shelves of Target and Best Buy and Walmart on Black Friday, place orders for hundreds and hundreds of dollars on Amazon, all in the so-called spirit of Christmas. It's almost comical. So what are we to conclude then? Would I like the feasting and the excesses of Christmas to stop? Well, certainly not. I rather enjoy those pagan excesses. And the gift-giving ritual doesn't have to involve consumerism. Some of the best gifts I've ever received were made by hand, or things of no monetary value at all. For my own taste, I'm not a Martin Luther. I don't want to purify the holiday of its non-Christian elements, get us back to a traditional pious celebration of the holiday. What interests me instead is the very fact that both Dionysus and Jesus Christ, understood here as two conflicting, contradictory forces within the human psyche, have expressed themselves in this holiday. And that's why I think maybe these ghost stories should come back. Maybe the way through this contradiction is to sincerely commit to the ethos of Dionysus and to the ethos of Jesus Christ, at least for this one day. Let your celebration and your indulgence be totally unself-conscious. Express your love for your family in embarrassing straightforwardness. Be cringe, get drunk, plan some indulgence or treat for yourself and your family that's truly special. But when it comes to the other side of that coin, the self-reflection demanded by the Christmas holiday, the reckoning with your mortality, assessing who and what you are and have become and are becoming in light of the finitude of human life and the spiritual significance of our lives. Fully commit to that too. Be totally self-conscious. Ask yourself what the ghosts of Christmas past, present, and future would show you about yourself should they come to you in the cold, dark night before Christmas. The beautiful thing about holidays is that they're untimely. Every set of holiday traditions is a little experience with recurrence, Every repetition of a holiday simultaneously takes us out of the chronological progression of our lives because we step away from work, from daily tasks and chores. But the holiday simultaneously leads us to reflect on the continuity of life. We can recall instances of the holiday from our own life story every single time we've experienced Christmas, and we're a different person coming back in the circle to that same point in the year. How at each time we were different, changing people. And yet the holiday is always the same. It's as if we have a moment to step outside the normal pace of life and at the same time take stock of it. And so at this most wonderful time of the year, I wish you all an introspective and untimely Christmas and a merry, indulgent Dionysus. It's a time when we can let Dionysus and the crucified put down their weapons for a time so that we can all enjoy a glass of wine together. Folks, what a wild ride it's been this year. Another warm thank you to everyone who participated in this special, who lent their ideas and their effort and their voice to the Nietzsche podcast. And thank you to all of you who have made this show possible, especially my patrons. I hope you've enjoyed all the contributions for the Christmas special as much as I have. Next time, we'll get back to our regularly scheduled programming. Soon it will be a new year. Amor, Fati, friends. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.